Hello everyone, I know you are going to use this video for falling asleep, so before that, like this video, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you are from, also what time is it. The first thing Ethan remembered was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, crushing silence that sits on your chest like a weight. He woke up in the back of a moving bus, headlights slicing through the endless darkness outside, and the silence of it all made his skin crawl. The bus was filled with passengers, yet none of them spoke, none of them shifted, none of them even seemed to breathe. Every seat was taken, every face fixed forward, pale and unmoving, as though he had stumbled into a photograph. The only sound was the soft, steady hum of the engine, carrying them deeper into some forgotten stretch of forest where the trees outside pressed in close, their limbs clawing against the windows like desperate fingers. He tried to remember how he had gotten there, but his thoughts came back in jagged fragments like glass scattered on the floor. A drink at the bar, a shadow at the edge of his vision, a hand, cold and firm, gripping his shoulder, and then nothing. The next thing he knew, he was here, a stranger among strangers, trapped in a silence so thick it seemed to vibrate. His heart hammered harder the longer he looked at the passengers, because the more he stared, the less human they seemed. Their clothes looked wrong, dated, stained, shredded in places as though they had crawled through the woods for years. Their hands rested stiffly in their laps, fingers curled like brittle twigs, and their faces. God, their faces, each one hollow-eyed, skin slack as if drained of life. He wanted to scream, to stand up and demand answers, but the silence swallowed his courage whole. Something told him that breaking it would be a mistake. The bus slowed. Gravel crunched beneath the tires, and Ethan dared to glance at the driver. The man's head was tilted slightly forward, cap pulled low, his knuckles white against the wheel. But something about the way he sat was unnatural. Too rigid, too still, as if he too were nothing more than a puppet held in place. The bus came to a stop beside a clearing, and Ethan's stomach dropped. There was no station, no building, not even a signpost. Only a single dirt path leading into the dark woods, its entrance marked by a bent wooden sign he couldn't fully read from here. The letters were chipped and smeared with grime, but he thought he caught glimpses of words, welcome and home, burned into the rotting wood. The passengers rose as one. Every bone in his body screamed at him not to follow, but as the pale figures began filing off the bus, their movements jerky but coordinated, he felt his own legs tremble and twitch. It was as though some invisible hand had wrapped around his limbs and was tugging him upright. His throat went dry. He tried to resist, to dig his fingers into the edge of the seat, but the pull was undeniable. His body didn't belong entirely to him anymore. When he stumbled into the aisle, his chest clenched with the horrible realization that he was no longer deciding his own steps. Something else was guiding him forward, forcing him into the same silent march as the others. They filed down the dirt path, the forest swallowing them whole. The trees loomed overhead like the blackened ribs of a giant corpse, branches knotting so tightly that even the moon's light struggled to break through. Every sound, the crunch of feet on dry leaves, the wind rattling branches, was muffled, muted, as though the woods themselves didn't want to be heard. Ethan's breath fogged in front of his face, the air growing colder with each step, until it felt like the forest was bleeding the warmth from his veins. And then he saw it. The town. Or at least what was left of one. Houses leaned against one another like drunks about to collapse, their windows shattered, their walls scrawled with scratches deep enough to gouge the wood. A church steeple rose in the distance, cracked and twisted, its bell long since torn free. Rusted swings creaked in a playground, swaying in a breeze he couldn't feel. And everywhere, that same crushing silence pressed down, as if the town itself had forgotten how to breathe. The passengers dispersed, each drifting toward some ruined building, slipping through broken doors and vanishing into shadows. Ethan stood at the edge of the street, frozen in place. He didn't want to step further into that place, but behind him the forest seemed to shift. The path he had come from had disappeared, swallowed by the trees, leaving only the road ahead. He realized with horror that there was no way back. A flicker of movement caught his eye. At the far end of the street, just past the gutted shell of what looked like a grocery store, stood a figure. Unlike the others, this one wasn't pale and slack-jawed. This one moved, slowly, purposefully. The figure stepped into the faint glow of a streetlight that buzzed weakly above, revealing the face of a little girl. Her dress was tattered, her hair matted with dirt, but her eyes burned with a sharpness that made his stomach twist. She lifted a hand and pointed directly at him. "New one," she whispered. The sound shattered the silence like glass, and for a heartbeat, the entire town seemed to flinch. The swings jerked, the trees groaned, and Ethan felt a dozen invisible eyes snap toward him. His blood ran cold. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but before he could, the girl tilted her head, her lips curling into something between a smile and a snarl. "They've been waiting for you." The world tilted. The silence deepened, and Ethan realized with sick certainty that whatever this place was, he wasn't just passing through. He had been brought here, and leaving was no longer his choice. But then the church bell rang. A low, hollow toll that rattled the bones in his body. The sound didn't echo. It lingered, crawling under his skin, vibrating against his ribs. The girl's smile vanished. She spun on her heel and darted into the shadows, leaving him alone in the middle of the ruined street. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was charged, like the air before a storm. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of that broken town, something began to move. The sound of dragging feet, claws scraping against pavement, a wet breath rattling through the dark. Ethan's body locked. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. He knew, with a certainty that curdled his blood, that the thing approaching wasn't one of the slack-jawed passengers. This was something worse, and it was coming for him. He stumbled backward, heart jackhammering, eyes darting for somewhere, anywhere, to hide. His gaze fell on a narrow alley between two houses. Without thinking, he bolted, his shoes slamming against the cracked pavement, every instinct screaming at him to run faster. Behind him, the dragging sound quickened, claws clicking against stone, closing the distance with unnatural speed. He flung himself into the alley, lungs burning, and pressed his back against the wall, praying the shadows would hide him. The sound stopped. The silence roared in his ears. Sweat trickled down his neck. Slowly, carefully, he peered around the corner and wished he hadn't. At the end of the street stood a figure, hunched and misshapen, its limbs too long, its body jerking with each breath. Its head turned slowly, impossibly far, until its face, or what passed for one, was aimed in his direction. Hollow sockets where eyes should have been, a mouth stitched shut with rusted wire. And yet he felt it smiling at him. The church bell tolled again, louder, and the figure twitched violently, as though the sound burned it. With a guttural hiss, it retreated into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan collapsed against the wall, his legs shaking so badly he thought they might snap. Somewhere in the distance, the little girl's voice echoed faintly through the night. "Don't let the bell stop." And for the first time, Ethan understood that the silence wasn't his enemy. It was the warning. The bell was the only thing keeping the real horrors at bay, and once it stopped, he didn't dare finish the thought. He glanced at the church steeple again, its cracked frame looming over the ruined town like a sentinel. If the bell was his only protection, then he had no choice but to go there. But as he stepped out of the alley, forcing his trembling legs to carry him forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following just behind him, silent, waiting, patient. And worse than that, it wanted him alive. The sky above the ghost town had deepened into a suffocating black, the kind that felt thick enough to choke on. The moon, if it was even still there, had vanished behind a veil of clouds that twisted like smoke. Ethan moved through the broken streets like a shadow himself, eyes darting, every step cautious. The ruins around him didn't feel dead. They felt dormant, like they were waiting for something, watching, listening. The road to the church stretched out ahead of him, and though it looked no longer than a few hundred feet, each step felt like wading through tar. Every cracked window whispered. Every creak in the wind sounded like a footstep behind him. He didn't dare look back again. He already knew, without question, that if he did, something would be standing there. Something not meant to be seen. Something that would know the moment he acknowledged it. The church loomed larger with every step, its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The stained glass windows shattered, leaving jagged teeth of colored glass around the frames. As he reached the steps, the bell tolled again. That same low, thunderous chime that rolled through the town like a warning, or a countdown. He paused at the foot of the church. Inside, there was only darkness. No candles, no light, nothing but the heavy breath of age and rot and dust. But he stepped through the doorway anyway, drawn by something deeper than fear, something primal. He needed answers. And this place, the heart of it all, might be the only place left that had them. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet, the echo loud in the emptiness. Pews stood in uneven rows, most overturned or broken, as if a great struggle had once taken place. Faint symbols were scratched into the walls, strange, looping marks that looked like they had been carved with fingernails. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic, like old blood. At the far end, beneath the shattered altar, a rope dangled from the bell tower. It swayed gently, though there was no wind inside. He approached it, half, expecting something to leap out of the shadows and drag him into the floor. But nothing came. Not yet. He stared up the rope toward the bell tower, then took hold of it with trembling hands. He didn't even need to pull. The moment his fingers wrapped around it, the bell above gave another loud, sonorous chime. It reverberated through his bones, a sound that seemed to split the air and cut through whatever unnatural quiet had buried itself in the town. He held the rope tighter. He didn't know how often he needed to ring it. He only knew he couldn't let it stop. As the echoes of the bell faded, a whisper slithered through the church. Not outside, inside. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was thin, high, and cold. A child's voice, but not the girl he'd seen earlier. This one came from behind the altar. Ethan froze. He turned, slowly, every nerve alight with dread. A boy stepped into view, no older than 10, dirty, barefoot, and soaking wet. Water dripped from his hair, from his clothes, pooling beneath his feet. And his eyes, they weren't eyes. They were black, deep enough to fall into. He stared at Ethan like he was something broken. She doesn't like new people, the boy said, his head twitching. She's already looking for you. Ethan's voice caught in his throat. Who? The boy stepped closer, and with every movement, the wet sound of dripping water followed. The one who waits. She doesn't live in the town. She lives underneath it. Underneath. Ethan glanced around. What are you talking about? There's a reason no one talks, the boy whispered. Their voices are hers now. They were given freely, or taken, and once you give yours, she never gives it back. He felt it then, a tingling in his throat like tiny fingers brushing against his vocal cords. Panic surged, and he looked down to see a thin mist curling around his ankles, creeping up from the floorboards. The boy's face cracked into a grin. You feel her, don't you? Ethan backed away, but the mist followed, slow and patient, rising like water in a sinking room. He turned and bolted from the altar, up a set of spiral stairs that led into the bell tower. His feet pounded against the stone, the air tightening with every step. The boy's laughter echoed behind him, distant but growing louder, as though it chased him through the walls. At the top of the stairs, he burst into the bell chamber. The great iron bell hung overhead, swaying slightly, its clapper stained with something dark. Through the shattered slats of the tower, he could see the town below, still, silent, rotting. And worse, something moved between the buildings. Shadows that walked upright, shapes that didn't belong to any person he'd ever seen. Then he saw her. She stood at the center of the town square. A woman in a long, tattered black dress, her face hidden behind a veil. Her hands were not hands. They were too long, too sharp, and they moved like spiders, dancing over the broken pavement. The people, those hollow, pale passengers, emerged from their houses and knelt before her, their heads bowed. One by one, they opened their mouths, and from each, a thread of light rose, pale shimmering, twisting upward, drawn to the veiled woman's outstretched hands. She was feeding. He stumbled back from the edge of the tower, heart slamming in his chest. His voice, he had to protect his voice. The bell. He grabbed the rope again and pulled hard. The bell shrieked into the night, louder this time, furious and sharp. Below, the veiled woman twitched. The light threads faltered. The passengers collapsed, and the shadows saw him. Their heads snapped upward, their mouths opened, and they began to climb. Not the stairs, the walls. They scuttled like insects, claws biting into the wood and stone, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Ethan screamed and pulled the bell again, but the rope resisted him now, as if it too had grown tired. Still, he pulled. Again. Again. And then the little girl was there, standing in the tower behind him. "She's almost done feeding," she said softly. "When she's full, she'll come for you." Ethan turned, wild-eyed. "Why me?" The girl tilted her head. "Because you came awake. What does that mean?" He cried, yanking the bell again as the shadows reached the window ledges. "You were supposed to sleep," she said, "like the others. Like we all did, at first." She stepped forward, placed a hand on his chest. "But something in you wouldn't stay quiet. That's why she's hungry. That's why she's rushing." Below them, the veiled woman had begun to climb too, not fast, not frantic, slow, steady. Like she knew exactly how long he had left. She used to live down there, the girl whispered, looking through the floor. In the old well beneath the town. They tried to bury her, but they only gave her time to grow. Ethan shook his head. "This isn't real." The girl looked at him sadly. "That's what I said." Then she vanished. He was alone. The first clawed hand appeared at the window. Then another. He backed up against the bell, arms trembling. The rope hung limp now. The bell would no longer ring. As the first of the things climbed into the tower, their faces blank and broken, Ethan realized something else. They weren't coming to kill him. They were coming to drag him below, to the well, to her. And as they closed in, grinning with lipless mouths, he knew this was only the beginning. The fall was not immediate. They didn't leap on him like beasts. They surrounded him like mourners at a wake. The clawed things that had climbed into the bell tower didn't speak, but their silence was thick with intent. Their eyes, or what remained of them, were grayish voids, murky with a kind of ancient pain, and they smelled like wet earth and long, rotted meat. One stepped forward and reached for Ethan with trembling fingers, not to tear, but to touch, to claim. He slapped the hand away and backed into the great bell with a metallic thud, the sound ringing out like a dying scream. Still, they didn't stop. They moved in unison, each step slow and precise, as though following a ritual choreographed long before Ethan had ever set foot in that town. He gritted his teeth and ran toward the narrow staircase that had brought him up. But it was already too late. More of them were crawling through the hatch at the base of the stairs, their bodies folding at odd angles to squeeze through. He froze, realizing in one terrible moment that there was no way out, no door, no ladder. No escape. The bell tower was a throat, and he was trapped in its mouth. And she, the veiled woman, was the voice that would swallow him. Just as panic clawed at his chest, the tower shook violently. Not from the creatures, not from wind, but from something beneath. A rumble groaned through the floorboards, a deep pulse that came from the earth itself. The creatures stopped, all of them at once, heads snapping up as if listening, their gray faces twisted in dismay. One let out a low hiss, not at Ethan, but at the sound beneath them. And then they began to retreat, not slowly, not in their ceremonial crawl, but fast. Like animals hearing the first notes of a predator's growl. They scrambled down the walls, dropped out of windows, vanished through the cracks in the floor. Within seconds, Ethan was alone in the bell tower again, his breath ragged, chest heaving. But the tower kept shaking. He clutched the wall, trying to stay upright. Dust rained from the beams above as something far below groaned. Something massive, ancient, and no longer content to stay buried. When the shaking finally stopped, a single new sound emerged from below, a whisper. Soft, feminine, and impossibly close. "Come down, Ethan." He turned, bile rising in his throat. The whisper hadn't come from below. It came from behind the bell. He stepped around it cautiously, heart thudding louder with each breath. She was there. Not the veiled woman from the square, no. This one had no veil, no face hidden. She was bare, her skin ash, pale, her eyes black and deep and endless. Her hair clung to her face like wet vines, and when she smiled, it was slow and crooked, as if her muscles were remembering the shape of the expression. She was crouched like a spider behind the bell, limbs too long, knees jutting the wrong way, fingers pressed against the floor. "I've been waiting," she said, her voice crawling across the air like fog. "They brought you to me." A voice still strong, a voice not yet hollowed. He didn't move, couldn't. Every inch of his body screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. "Why me?" he managed to choke out. Her smile widened, cracked at the corners. "Because you're still dreaming. The others woke up too soon. You, though you're different. You hear me even now. You felt me before you even arrived. That little pull at the edge of your sleep. That itch behind your eyes." She began to crawl toward him, not walking, not slithering, something in between. Her body made no sound, even when her limbs cracked into unnatural angles. He backed away, legs trembling. "They let me rot beneath this town," she hissed, "long before you were born. Before their cities and stories. Before their gods had names. But they could never keep me locked away. Not completely." She stood upright then, impossibly tall, her spine bending backwards with a sickening pop. "You pulled the bell, Ethan. That was your choice. You rang it, and now it tolls for you." With a sudden jolt, he bolted past her. His shoulder clipped her arm, cold and brittle like dead branches. And for one horrifying second, he felt something slip into his skin. A chill that reached his bones. But he didn't stop. He ran for the stairs and plunged downward 2 steps at a time, gripping the rotted railings as the tower moaned around him. He didn't care where he ended up, just so long as it was far from her. The moment his feet hit the main floor of the church, he kept running, bursting through the door, back into the ruined street. The air outside had thickened with mist. The town was shifting again. Houses had moved. Streets had rearranged. The playground was gone. The trees leaned closer now, their limbs bending in unnatural arcs, casting shadows that twisted with purpose. And in the middle of it all stood the little girl. "You saw her," she said flatly. "Didn't you?" He nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. "She doesn't like being looked at," the girl whispered. "You've made her real again." Behind them, the bell let out a final groan, and then fell silent. Ethan turned back toward the church just in time to see the tower cave in on itself. Stone and wood folded inward like a collapsing lung. Dust rose into the air like smoke from a pyre. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It was total, consuming, as if the sound itself had been erased from the world. She's out now, the girl said. And this time, she won't wait in the well. Ethan's throat closed. What is she? The girl's expression didn't change, but her eyes darkened. She's the hunger that memory can't bury. She's what's left when belief dies, and she wants to live again. Thunder cracked in the distance, not from the sky, but from underground. The ground trembled once more, and from the cracks in the street, a thick black tar began to seep. It smelled of rot and sorrow, of grave dirt and forgotten names. It moved with a mind of its own, slithering toward Ethan's feet like 1,000 dead hands. "Where can I go?" he whispered. The girl looked up at him, her voice barely audible. "Nowhere, but you can hide, for a little while." She pointed toward the trees, no longer forest, but something deeper, older, with no path, no light, only darkness stretching for miles. "She doesn't follow the rules in there," the girl said. "She hates the trees. They remember her." Ethan didn't hesitate. He ran toward the edge of the forest, the mist pulling at his legs like pleading ghosts. As he crossed into the tree line, the sounds of the town behind him disappeared entirely. No wind, no breath, only silence, but not peace. He knew she was behind him now, walking slowly, patiently, dragging her limbs through the streets she once ruled. And every time he slowed, he could feel her getting closer, not by footfall or shadow, but by weight, a pressure, like the sky was bending around her presence. He pushed deeper into the woods, branches slapping at his face, roots tangling beneath his feet. His lungs burned, his chest ached, but he didn't stop. Not when the trees whispered his name. Not when the fog thickened until he could barely see his own hands. Not even when he heard her voice again, soft, sweet, just behind his ear. "Ethan." He didn't look back. He couldn't. Because deep down, something inside him whispered the truth. The moment he looked back, she would wear his face next. The forest was unlike anything Ethan had ever known. It didn't feel like earth. The ground was damp and spongy, almost breathing beneath his feet, and the trees bent in impossible ways, as if watching him, as if waiting for him to make a wrong move. The darkness between them wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence. A living thing that pressed in around him, whispering with 1,000 voices he couldn't quite make out. Some begged, some wept, some laughed softly, like broken music boxes winding down, but none of them led the way. No path, no direction, just endless trees and the growing weight of something terrible behind him. Ethan moved blindly, hands outstretched, fingers brushing bark that felt more like skin than wood. Every now and then he'd catch the faintest rustle, not in the leaves, but in the earth below, like something crawling, something that had never needed eyes to find him. The further he went, the less real everything felt. Time twisted, space folded in on itself. He passed the same crooked tree 3 times. He was sure of it. Its trunk bore a split shaped like a screaming mouth, and the smell around it was unbearable, like old meat left to rot in a wet basement. But every time he saw it, the scream in the bark looked wider, deeper, more desperate. And then came the laughter. Not her laughter. Children. They giggled from behind trees, high-pitched, playful, twisted at the edges with something wrong. Ethan spun around, trying to spot them, but there was no movement. Just shadow and fog in that laughter, so close he could feel it on his skin. "Come play," one voice chirped. Another, older and darker, chimed in, "You're it." Leaves crunched behind him, then in front. He broke into a run, branches slapping his face, thorns biting into his arms, but the laughter followed. It danced around him, never fading, never tiring, until suddenly, it stopped. Just like that. One moment, a cacophony of giggles echoing all around him, and the next, stillness. He stumbled into a clearing, his chest heaving, lungs burning. The forest floor here was bare, no leaves, no grass, just dirt, and in the center stood a single object, a mirror, 7 feet tall, framed in blackened wood carved with faces that screamed in frozen agony. He approached it slowly, afraid of what he'd see, half expecting the veiled woman to be there behind his reflection, smiling that awful broken smile. But it wasn't her. It was himself, almost. The man in the mirror looked like him, yes, but older, gaunt, eyes sunken, skin pale and stretched thin over sharp bones. His reflection didn't breathe, didn't blink. It simply stared. And then it spoke. "You're not going to make it." Ethan froze. "None of us did." The reflection whispered, "You think you're different because you pulled the bell. But that was the worst thing you could have done. You didn't stop her. You woke her." The image stepped forward. Its movements didn't match Ethan's anymore. It had broken free. It pressed its hand against the glass from the inside. "She's under your skin now. You feel it, don't you?" Ethan didn't answer, but he did feel it. That cold tingling just beneath the surface, like something nesting in his blood, curling tighter with every heartbeat. "She can see through you, and soon she'll speak with your mouth." The mirror cracked. A thin, splintering line ran down the center, and the reflection's face began to distort, warping into a grotesque sneer. It opened its mouth, and a swarm of moths burst from the glass, thousands of them flooding into the clearing. Ethan cried out and stumbled back, batting at the cloud as it enveloped him. They didn't bite, but their wings scratched at his skin, dry and cold and frantic. They crawled into his clothes, his mouth, his ears. Then, just as suddenly, they were gone. The clearing was empty again. But the mirror had changed. It now showed a different scene. Not his reflection, but a place. The church, in ruins. The bell tower flattened. And standing in the middle of the rubble was the veiled woman. Only now, the veil was gone. Her face was hollow. An endless pit of darkness where eyes and mouth should be. And around her were the townspeople, crawling. Not walking, not kneeling. Crawling like insects, their bodies twisted and twitching. She raised her arms and they screamed, not with voices, but with light pouring from their mouths. The mirror shattered. Glass exploded outward, and Ethan shielded his face, cuts blooming across his arms. When he looked up, the clearing was gone. The forest had changed again. Now it was older somehow. Darker. The trees were wider, deeper. Their roots pulsed beneath his feet, and directly in front of him stood the little girl. Her dress was torn now, her eyes bloodshot. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she didn't speak in riddles. "She wants your name." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Why?" "She feeds on them," the girl whispered. "A name is power. A name is a door. Once you give it, she walks through." "I never told her," Ethan said, voice trembling. "She already knows. You said it once. When you were afraid." He tried to remember. The bus, the church, the tower. Had he said it aloud? The girl reached for his hand. "We don't have long. The forest can't hold her forever. But there's a place, deeper in, where she can't go." "Why?" The girl's hand was cold. She didn't answer. She turned and began to walk. Ethan followed, stepping over roots that moved when they thought he wasn't looking. The trees grew closer together. The mist thickened, turning yellow, then red. The air smelled of rust and old rain. The path they took, if it could be called that, led them to an arch made of bones. Dozens of skulls, arranged in a curve, all facing inward. Some human, some not. "She can't follow through here," the girl said, stepping under the arch, "but you need to keep walking. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see." He hesitated, and then he heard it, behind him. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. A voice, his voice, whispered from the shadows. Ethan, it wasn't the veiled woman this time. It was his mother's voice. Soft, loving, familiar. From the time before the dreams, before the town, before the silence. "Don't go with her," the voice said. "She's lying to you." Ethan's blood turned to ice. "She died 10 years ago," he said aloud. The girl didn't turn around. "She knows who you miss." "Ethan," the voice said again. "Please, you don't know what's waiting past the bones." "But I do, and I won't let you get hurt." He closed his eyes. The footsteps drew closer. Then another voice joined in. This one was his father's, then his brother's, then people he hadn't thought of in years. They were all calling for him, reaching into his mind, into his heart. "Keep walking," the girl said again, "or stay and let her wear your skin." Ethan ran through the bone arch into the deeper forest. The voices stopped the moment he crossed the threshold. Silence fell again, but not the same kind as before. This silence was gentle, heavy but not suffocating, peaceful, almost. He turned back. The arch was gone. So was the girl. He was alone. And somewhere, far behind him, she screamed, not in rage, in hunger. And Ethan knew that the forest had only bought him time. Soon she would find the cracks in this place too. And when she did, hiding would no longer be enough. He would have to face her. But how do you fight something that doesn't die? How do you kill what was never alive to begin with? It began with the trees whispering again. This time, it wasn't laughter or voices from his past. It was something else. Urgent, desperate. Ethan stood at the center of a forest that should not have existed, surrounded by trees that bent toward him like mourners, their branches twitching with nervous tension. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of damp moss and old wood. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost sponge, like as though the forest floor had soaked up too much blood over the years and never quite dried. The silence here was different, thicker, more natural than the deathly quiet of the town, but still laced with danger. He took a few tentative steps forward, but each footfall seemed to echo deeper than it should, like the earth was hollow beneath him. He didn't know where he was going. The girl was gone. The bone arch had vanished behind him. And worst of all, the feeling was back, that sensation he'd first felt on the bus, that something was walking just behind him, always just out of sight, always watching. He tried to shake the thought, but the moment he stopped moving, the forest responded. The trees swayed without wind. A low groan rumbled through the roots. Something beneath the surface stirred. He pressed forward, ducking beneath low, hanging limbs that felt too much like arms. And then, out of nowhere, a voice. "You're getting close." He spun around. Nothing but trees. "I've seen you," the voice said again, female this time. Gentle. "Cold, you dream too loud. That's why she found you." Ethan backed up slowly, eyes scanning the darkness. "Who are you?" The air shifted, the mist thickened, and then, from behind a tree, stepped a woman. Not the veiled horror from the town. This one looked almost normal, too normal. Her dress was white, spotless, untouched by the filth of the forest. Her skin was pale, her eyes gray. She smiled at him like an old friend returning home. "You've walked farther than most," she said. "But this forest, it doesn't save you. It just delays the end." He didn't answer. His instincts screamed to run, but his body wouldn't move. "She came from under the town." "Yes," the woman continued, circling him slowly. "But that wasn't her origin, only her prison. Long ago, before they built their homes and churches, before they carved roads into the land, she was already here, buried deep, sleeping." Ethan swallowed. "Then why did they build the town on top of her?" The woman stopped walking. Her smile faded. "Because they thought they could hold her down. Foolish men, with their rituals and bells. They thought iron and prayer could cage a god." He blinked. "God. Not the kind you worship," she said. "The kind you fear. The kind that eats memories. That strips people of their names and wears their faces like masks. She is not bound by flesh. She is hunger and voice and silence. She is what waits at the bottom of every well." And now she walks again. Ethan took a step back, then helped me stop her. The woman's eyes darkened. "You don't stop her. You survive her." "How?" She tilted her head. "You don't give her what she wants." "What is that?" She stepped closer. "You." In an instant, her face began to change. Skin stretched, teeth elongated, eyes turned black as oil. Her white dress stained red from the inside out, as if blood soaked her bones, and had finally started to leak through. Ethan stumbled back in horror, realizing too late that he had been led. She had drawn him deeper into the forest, not to help him escape, but to isolate him. She lunged. He turned and ran. Branches clawed at him, thorns ripped open his arms, and the trees howled with every step. The forest had changed again. It wanted to keep him. Roots burst from the ground to trip him. Vines whipped around his legs. The path was gone. Only noise and motion and pain remained. He didn't know how far he ran, only that when he stopped, it wasn't by choice. He crashed into a clearing and collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The trees here had pulled back, forming a near, perfect circle around a massive stone well. It stood at the center of the clearing like a monument to forgotten horrors. No roof, no bucket, just a mouth in the ground, ringed by stones slick with moss and age. Ethan crawled toward it, half against his will. Something inside pulled at him. Not physically, but emotionally. The well called to him like an old friend. He could feel it in his bones. It remembered him, even if he didn't remember it. When he reached the edge and looked down, the darkness inside seemed to stretch forever. There was no bottom. Only black, only a vast, yawning hunger. He felt her gaze then, not from above, from below. Rising like a heat, she was down there, waiting, and she was awake. A voice rose from the well, not hers but his own. It echoed upward, twisted and wrong, repeating a phrase he didn't remember saying. "I give you my name." The words pierced him like a knife. No. No, he hadn't said that. He would never. But he had. Somewhere back in the tower, in a moment of fear, a whisper in the dark. He'd said his name aloud. And now she had it. The ground trembled. Cracks spiderwebbed out from the base of the well. The trees shuddered and moaned, and something began to climb. Not fast, not frantic, steady. Sure, like death with a timetable. He stumbled back, but the forest behind him was gone. Walls of thorns and rot rose up in its place. The clearing was no longer open, it was a cage. The only way out now was down. He turned, his breath ragged. A shape was rising from the well. First fingers, then arms, then a face, not veiled this time. No illusions, no games. Her eyes were not empty. They were filled with every voice she had ever stolen, screaming silently. Trapped, she reached for him. And Ethan did the only thing left. He screamed. The forest held its breath, and the scream wasn't his. Not anymore. The scream echoed long after Ethan's mouth had closed. It twisted through the air like smoke, wrapping around the trees, curling into the cracks of the ancient well. But it wasn't his voice. He had felt it tear out of him, yes, but the tone, the shape of it, the sound, it belonged to her now. She had taken it. The realization struck him not like a thought, but like a memory. Like something ancient inside him had always known this moment would come. His voice, the last piece of himself that was truly his, had been ripped away and folded into the fabric of something he couldn't fight. He clutched his throat, gasping, but no sound came. Not a cough, not a cry, just air. Empty and useless. The thing climbing from the well didn't rush. It didn't need to. She rose with calm, steady grace, her form towering now, more shadow than flesh. She had no bones, only shape, her arms flowing like smoke, her fingers too long, trailing behind her like dripping paint. And her face, what little could be called a face, was changing constantly. One moment it wore Ethan's features, twisted in pain. Then the little girl's face. Then the woman in white. Then his mother's. Then dozens more, shifting faster than he could count, flickering like dying candlelight. Ethan tried to run but stumbled instead, his legs shaking beneath him like snapped branches. The forest pressed in tighter. The trees had turned toward him, literally turned. Roots snapping and twisting, as if they'd rotated their entire trunks to face him. Their bark bulged and groaned, covered now in carvings of screaming mouths and hollow eyes. Every branch pointed at the well, at him. As though even the forest, ancient and wild as it was, knew it had failed. He staggered backward, but the clearing had shrunk. The thorns surrounding it now pulsed with a slow rhythm, like lungs. Living, breathing, blocking every exit. And through the hush, he could hear the whispers again, louder this time, not from around him, from inside him. Voices that spoke his memories, taunting him with things he hadn't thought about in years. The day his father died. The night he'd been drunk enough to say, "I wish I didn't exist." The time he watched his younger brother cry in the hospital and pretended not to care. Every guilt, every regret, spoken back to him in his own stolen voice. She was inside now. Ethan dropped to his knees. He didn't know what to do. His body was failing him, his mind unraveling, and she, this thing, this old, unburied wound in the earth, was finally whole. She had his voice. She had his name. And now she had him surrounded. But then, a bell, faint, distant. Wrong. It didn't come from the town. It didn't come from the church. It came from the woods. Ethan's eyes widened. A second bell, then a third, then many, all tolling at once, each with a different pitch, different rhythm, like a choir of broken towers waking from their slumber. And as the bells rang, the shadows around the clearing began to twitch. The thorn walls shrank back a few inches. The thing in the well paused. She looked up, and though she had no fixed eyes, Ethan could feel her confusion, her irritation. Something was interfering. Then the forest groaned, not in pain, but in resistance, and that's when he saw them. Figures stepping out from between the trees. Not alive, not dead, not like the pale, hollow people from the town. These were different, faded, transparent, glowing faintly with a bluish hue. Men, women, children, dozens of them. Hundreds. Their faces were calm, peaceful, and some of them looked familiar. Too familiar. One of them, Ethan almost choked, wore his own face. His doppelganger stepped forward. Eyes locked on the shadow climbing from the well, it opened its mouth and screamed. Sound tore through the clearing, but this scream wasn't hers. It was his again, his voice, freed. The scream ripped through the air like a blade, and the forest shook with its force. The trees bent away. The roots recoiled. The thorn wall collapsed into ash, and the thing in the well screamed back. Only now she screamed in rage. She clawed at the edge of the stones, trying to hold her place, but the wind that came with Ethan's scream was stronger. A storm forged of memory and fury. The ghostly figures stepped forward in unison, their mouths opening, each one adding their own voice to the storm. And she began to descend. Not by choice, she was being pulled, dragged, banished. She screamed in defiance. And Ethan's voice, his true voice, rang out from her mouth, distorted and furious. But it wasn't hers anymore. The forest had taken it back. She clung to the stones, fingers cracking, shadows flailing. But the ground opened wider beneath her, and the well became a chasm. The roots beneath the earth came alive, lashing up to drag her down. One last time, she looked at Ethan, and this time, the face she wore was not a stranger's. It was his, whispering with lips that were almost his, "You'll be mine eventually." Then she was gone, swallowed by the dark. The well sealed shut with a shuddering groan. The wind stopped. The bells fell silent. The forest sighed. Ethan collapsed. He didn't sleep. He just stopped. Somewhere between exhaustion and death. When he opened his eyes, the sky above was pale gray, no longer black. The trees were still twisted, but no longer reaching for him. The clearing was empty. The well had vanished. Only a circle of cracked stone remained. Moss already creeping over its surface like nature was trying to forget it had ever been there. He stood slowly, every muscle aching, every breath painful. The ghostly figures were gone. But in the distance, he saw the little girl. She stood at the edge of the forest, watching. When he reached her, she didn't smile. "She's gone," he rasped. "No," the girl replied. "Just sleeping again. I didn't win." "You survived," she said. "That's what people call winning. But she never dies. She just waits." He swallowed hard. For what? For the next voice, the next name. She turned to walk away, her bare feet silent on the soil. "You need to leave. Before the sun sets again." "Where do I go?" She paused. And for the first time, she looked truly sad. "You don't go anywhere," she said. "You go back." He frowned. "Back where?" "To the bus." His blood ran cold. "No." "Yes," she said. "That's the only way out." He looked behind him. The forest was shifting again. The trees leaned forward. The whispers were returning. "If you stay," she said, "you'll just become another voice she wears." Ethan didn't argue. He turned and began to walk, back through the woods. Back through the bone arch, which was somehow there again. Back through the dead town, its streets still empty, its church still broken. He didn't look too closely at the windows this time. He knew better. The shadows inside were still watching. And there it was. The bus, sitting at the edge of the path, headlights on, doors open. He stepped inside, and the passengers were there again. Not moving, not breathing, not alive. He took the same seat he had woken in before, and as the door hissed shut behind him, the bus began to move. The wheels hummed beneath him, a steady, low vibration that pulsed through the floor of the bus and into Ethan's bones. He sat frozen in the same cracked vinyl seat, watching the treetops pass like a film strip out the window, but the silence was louder than before. Not the supernatural, soul-crushing silence of the town, but something else, something worse. This silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things unsaid, of screams swallowed, of names that had been taken. The passengers still hadn't moved, still hadn't breathed, still hadn't blinked. But now, something about them was different. Their skin seemed tighter, their mouths a little more closed, their eyes not quite as blank. They looked less like corpses and more like people caught between sleep and nightmare, frozen in that breathless moment just before the scream. The road uncoiled ahead of them like a tongue stretching into the dark. The headlights didn't light up much beyond a few feet, but Ethan got the sickening sense that this road didn't lead out of the woods. It didn't even feel like it was circling back. It felt like it was digging deeper. Like the bus wasn't a vehicle anymore. It was a shovel, and it was burying them all over again. He leaned toward the window, looking past the rows of lifeless figures, and something flickered at the corner of his vision, something sitting in the seat across the aisle. Slowly, cautiously, he turned. It was her, the little girl, except she wasn't a little girl anymore. She looked older now, maybe 13. Her eyes darker, her posture straighter. Her dress was no longer ragged, no longer childish. It was clean, black, almost ceremonial. And when she looked at him, she didn't wear the same wary expression from before. Now, she looked calm and expectant. "I thought you left," Ethan said, voice dry, raspy from too much silence. "I did," she replied. Her voice had changed too, no longer the trembling whisper of a frightened child. Now it was confident, almost practiced. "But I came back to make sure you don't forget." He swallowed hard. "Forget what?" "That you weren't supposed to get this far." Ethan stared at her. "What do you mean?" "You were meant to sleep," she said. "That's what the bus is for. It doesn't take you home. It takes you under." Ethan felt a chill creep across his skin. Under where? She leaned in slightly, her eyes locked onto his. Under everything. Under thought. Under memory. The place where she waits when she's not walking. It's the only place quiet enough for her to rest. The bus turned sharply, the tires grinding against loose gravel. Outside the windows, the forest blurred into strange, melted shapes. Trees that bent backward, rivers that flowed upward. The world beyond the glass no longer followed any rules Ethan understood. Time didn't exist here. Direction was a lie. "You said I survived," he said, his voice barely holding together. "I made it through the forest. I pushed her back. Why am I here again?" The girl blinked slowly. "Because you left a piece of yourself behind, and she found it." He stared down at his hands, suddenly unsure if they were still his. His fingers trembled, and he realized with horror that he couldn't remember how many he'd had to begin with. 5, 6, 10. The details were slipping, just a little, but it was enough. What piece? he asked, panic rising. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze to the front of the bus. And that's when Ethan noticed something that hadn't been there before. A mirror, mounted above the driver's seat. It hadn't been there the first time. He would have remembered. In the mirror, he expected to see the back rows of seats, the dead-eyed passengers, the hollow stares. But he didn't. In the mirror, the bus was full of people screaming, mouths stretched impossibly wide, eyes wild and furious, hands clawing at the air, at their own faces, at each other. Every passenger, a prisoner, trapped behind some invisible layer of glass, unable to make a sound. Their screams were silent, but their agony was not. He couldn't look away, and then he saw himself, not in his seat, standing, in the aisle, screaming with the rest of them. But here he was, sitting, watching. "I don't understand," he whispered. The girl's voice grew colder. "That's not you watching the bus. That's you still on it, you never left." The bus engine groaned. The road turned to stone. Ethan looked around. The trees outside had vanished. Now there were only walls, tall, wet, dripping, like the inside of a cave, or something worse. They weren't driving through land anymore. They were driving through her. Through whatever was left of her mind. And the further they drove, the more Ethan began to feel it, his memories bleeding at the edges, his thoughts getting heavier, slower. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't move. "You're not supposed to fight it," the girl said softly. "That's how she gets in." Ethan grit his teeth. "Then why did you help me? In the forest? At the well? Why show me how to fight her if it was all just this?" Her expression changed again, just for a second. She looked tired, angry, sad. And then she said something that made his blood run cold. "Because I thought you were strong enough to finish what I couldn't." Ethan's breath caught. "You?" She nodded. "I was the first." The words hung in the air like fog. "I pulled the bell," she said. "I screamed. I ran. I fought. Just like you. And I got away. Just far enough to realize I'd never actually left. That I'd always been here. That I'd never stopped riding the bus." Ethan shook his head. No, that's not true. I was out there. I felt it. And so did I," she replied. "At first. That's how she feeds. She lets you believe you escaped. That you won. So you stop fighting. And when you stop, she takes the rest of you." The passengers stirred. One shifted in its seat, twitching. Another blinked. Ethan watched in horror as the entire bus began to shift in tone. The silence fractured. The air thickened. The walls of the cave, or throat, or tunnel, or whatever they were, closed in. And then the driver turned around. He hadn't moved since Ethan had boarded. But now, slowly, his head rotated, neck creaking like old wood. His face was missing. Just blank flesh where eyes and mouth should be. But somehow Ethan still knew. It was her. Not in full form, not yet, just a fragment, a piece of her mind, riding the bus, guiding it, herding them all deeper into the dark. "Where does this end?" Ethan asked, barely able to speak. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she began to fade. Her form flickered like smoke caught in a jar. "You still have one choice," she whispered as her body unraveled. "One way out." He turned to look at her fully, but she was gone. The seat across from him was empty. And then, he heard it again. The bell. Just one toll. Far, far in the distance. But enough. He grabbed the edge of the seat and pulled himself up. His knees screamed in protest. His head spun. But he stood. The passengers were moving now, turning toward him. All of them. He pushed past them. Down the aisle toward the front of the bus. Toward the driver. Each step felt like it took a year. The air fought against him. Every molecule thick with memory and despair. Faces reached for him from the windows. Shadows crawled under the seats. But he kept going, until he reached the driver, and reached for the wheel. The faceless thing didn't stop him, because it didn't expect him to try. His fingers closed around the wheel, and he turned it. Hard. The bus screamed as metal scraped against stone. The entire vehicle lurched. Passengers thrown sideways. The mirror above shattered, the illusion cracked, and for the first time, the bus stopped. Ethan fell to the floor. Everything went black, and when he opened his eyes, he wasn't on the bus anymore. He was standing in a room, white, empty, silent, and in front of him a door, just one, closed, and behind it something was breathing. The room was impossibly white, not the sterile kind found in hospitals, but a white that felt hollow, featureless, soundless, a place where time had no pulse. Ethan stood barefoot on a floor that reflected nothing. No shadow, no color, no warmth. It was like standing in a memory someone had tried to erase. And yet, the door in front of him was real. He could feel it. The wood looked aged, cracked around the edges like it had been clawed at for years. There was no knob, no handle, just a frame and a faint rhythmic sound coming from the other side. Breathing, slow, deep. As if whatever was waiting had been asleep for a very long time, and was now slowly waking. He took a step forward, and the room responded. The light dimmed just slightly, enough for the silence to feel even heavier. He didn't remember standing up. He didn't remember leaving the bus. But something inside him told him this wasn't a continuation. It wasn't a dream. It was a threshold. And he was standing on the edge of it. Something about the door felt familiar in the worst way, like deja vu that twisted your stomach instead of your heart. The breath on the other side grew louder. It wasn't gasping or ragged. It was controlled. Measured. The kind of breath someone takes when they're savoring the moment before a kill. Ethan hesitated. He thought of the girl, of the bell, of the mirror, of the well, of his own scream, still echoing in some distant version of himself that might still be trapped in the bus, clawing at the windows. And then he did something he hadn't done in what felt like days. He spoke. His voice was hoarse, cracked like dry earth. "I'm still here." The breathing on the other side stopped. Not for long, just a second. A pause, a blink. Then the door creaked. Not open, just a slight shift. Enough to let out a sigh of air that smelled of damp stone, rotting leaves, and old metal. The scent of things buried too long. Ethan reached out, his hand trembling. He touched the wood. It was warm, and it pulsed, once, like a living heart. The shock ran through his fingers, up his arm, into his chest. For a moment he forgot his own name. Then it came back in a rush, along with a scream not his own. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was behind him. He turned sharply, but the room was still empty. No shadows, no walls, just white stretching in every direction. But he knew that voice. It was his. Not echoing, not distorted. His exact voice, speaking from behind him, even as he stood alone. And then he understood. He hadn't left the bus. Not entirely. A piece of him was still there. And worse, as another piece had followed him here. He turned back toward the door. It was open now. Just enough to reveal a sliver of the space beyond. Darkness, not just black, but the complete absence of light. The kind of dark that didn't just hide things. It devoured them. He stepped closer, and this time, the breath returned. But now it wasn't just breathing. It was whispering, low, fast. Words layered on top of each other in a spiral of sounds, languages, names. And at the center of it all, he heard one word repeated over and over, his name. Not shouted, not screamed, spoken in reverence. In hunger, he stepped through the door, and the world vanished. The sensation was like falling, but without gravity. The floor was gone. The walls were gone. Even the air had disappeared. He didn't float. He didn't sink. He simply ceased to belong to space. And then came the voices. All at once, all of them. Every name she had ever taken. Every face she had ever worn. They flooded into him like a wave, drowning his thoughts, his memories, replacing them with hers. The veiled woman, the child, the passengers, the mirror, the forest, all of it. Her. She wasn't a being. She was a place, a cycle, a disease, a religion without scripture. And he was now inside her, and she was inside him. He screamed again, not to escape, but to hold on. to anchor himself in the sound of something he still owned. And in that scream he felt a thread, thin, taut. It led somewhere. He followed it. The darkness cracked, and he fell through. He hit the ground hard, lungs burning, limbs aching. The sky above him was blood, red, the horizon bent like the edges of a ruined photograph. He sat up and realized he was no longer in the room, no longer in the white void, and definitely no longer on the bus. This was something new. A place outside places. The buildings around him floated, some sideways, some upside down. Trees grew from rooftops. Rivers flowed through the sky like torn ribbons. The ground shifted constantly beneath his feet, rippling like a living thing trying to shake him off. This wasn't a dream. This was her domain. Raw, exposed, and in the center of it all, she stood, not hiding now, not veiled, not wearing a stolen face, just herself, a thing made of mouths, of arms, of voices. She moved like a storm-given shape, and every time Ethan blinked, she changed, her body made of memory, of screams, of names still echoing. And then she looked at him. 1,000 eyes opened, 1,000 hands reached, and from 1,000 mouths, she spoke, "I am all you forgot." Ethan didn't run. He couldn't. There was no place to go. He simply stood, body trembling, and said the only thing left in him. "My name is mine." It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a chant. It was a declaration. And for the first time since he stepped into that town, since the bell tolled, since the mirror cracked, she recoiled. Just slightly. But enough. The ground beneath him pulsed. A circle of fire blazed outward from his feet. Not real fire, but something brighter, something louder. Memory. Truth. The kind that couldn't be taken. He stepped forward. She screamed. But the sound didn't shake him anymore. Because it was no longer his. It was hers alone. And she was finally afraid. The ground pulsed with a rhythm not entirely his own. Every step Ethan took sent a wave of pressure rolling through the cracked, shifting landscape, causing the floating ruins to tremble in the crimson sky. He wasn't sure if this world, this fractured place stitched together from memory, madness, and shadow, was actually reacting to him, or if it was her, pulling at the seams, trying to fold the space in on itself like a collapsing lung. Either way, something was unraveling. Whether it was her domain or his mind, he couldn't yet tell. She stood in the center of the chaos, the embodiment of everything that should have never been remembered. Her form swayed like smoke and muscle, a blend of limbs and mouths, shifting endlessly, as if she couldn't decide which stolen identity to wear. One moment she looked like the little girl, the next like Ethan's brother, then the driver of the bus, the bell tower priest, the woman in white, his own face, each flickering for only a second, but real enough to make his stomach turn. And beneath it all she pulsed with sound, not speech, not song, but raw, unbearable noise. The collected screams of everyone she'd consumed, layered so deeply they became a hum, like a wire straining to snap. And yet, she hesitated. Ethan knew why. The fire beneath his feet. It wasn't real flame, but memory, pure and bright and loud. The truth of his name, his voice, his scream. Something she had tried to consume but hadn't digested. She had fed on his fear, yes, had taken pieces of his mind and hollowed his voice for her choir, but something deeper had resisted. Something she couldn't wear, couldn't swallow, and that terrified her. Ethan stepped forward again. The fire circle expanded with him, glowing brighter, pushing her back. Her limbs twitched, her shape stuttered. From her 1,000 mouths came a noise, not rage, but pleading. "Give it back," she whispered, voice splintering into pieces. "Let me finish you." But he didn't stop. He remembered now what he had left behind. Not just the scream in the bell tower, not just the part of him that had remained on the bus. There was a moment, buried deep in the panic, when he had looked into the mirror and seen his reflection screaming, but hadn't joined in. That small act, that tiny refusal, had planted something. Defiance. And it had grown. She shrieked again, louder now, the sound shaking the very fabric of the world. Buildings cracked and shattered. Rivers burst into flame. Trees tore themselves from the earth and twisted into screaming silhouettes. But Ethan kept walking. As he drew closer, her shape unraveled further. Mouths fused together. Arms bent inward. Her 1,000 eyes rolled back in pain. She reached for him, claws outstretched, but the fire around him licked her skin like acid. Every time she touched it, her flesh split open into a swarm of moths and ash. And then she said the one thing that made him stop. He called for me. Ethan froze. What? He breathed. Her voice deepened, the air vibrating with the weight of it. Before you came here. Before the bell. Before the forest. He whispered it. One name. One wish. She twisted her face into a mockery of his father's. A grin full of broken teeth, he said. Take me instead. Ethan stumbled. His father. Dead for years. Buried and mourned and gone. But she wasn't lying. He saw it. The memory hadn't been his, but it was there, in the spaces between her flickering forms. A hospital room, machines hissing, a hand grasping a dying man's wrist, and then the whisper. A pact. A bargain. He offered himself, she hissed. But I found you first. Ethan's knees buckled. His flame dimmed. She lunged, and then the bell tolled. Once. Just once. But it rang through the air like thunder cracking across glass. She screamed and recoiled, folding in on herself, clutching her face. And then Ethan saw him, standing on the far side of the broken horizon. His father, not as a ghost, not like the girl, but as he had looked in life, strong, tired. But there, he held the bell rope in both hands, knuckles white, pulling it again. The bell tolled a second time, and Ethan remembered everything. The accident, the hospital, the guilt. He'd been the one driving, the one who'd walked away with only scratches while his father lay comatose for weeks. And then, one night had simply died. No explanation, no warning, because he hadn't just died, he had offered himself. To her. To the thing under the town, under memory, under sleep. To spare Ethan. And now, she had broken the deal. Because she was hungry. Because she always came back. And Ethan had been her loophole. The third toll shattered the space between them. Ethan screamed, not in fear, not in despair, but in fury. And this time his scream wasn't taken. It became a weapon. The fire beneath him exploded outward in a wave of golden light, engulfing the space, the world, her. She tried to run, tried to shift, to morph, to vanish. But the bell tolled again, and again, and again. Each time louder, each time closer. The flames caught her, wrapped her in light. She burned not like flesh, but like paper soaked in oil. Her bodies, her faces, her mouths disintegrating mid-scream. And Ethan walked forward through it all, eyes locked on her melting form. You don't get to wear me, he said. You don't get to speak with my voice. And with one final step, he touched her. And she was gone, not shattered, not killed, just gone. As if she had never been, as if the silence had taken her back. Ethan stood alone in a world that no longer spun, no longer screamed, no longer moved. And the bell tolled one last time, and stopped. He closed his eyes, breathed in, and woke up. On the floor of his apartment, no forest, no bus, no bell tower, no veil. Just morning sunlight bleeding through cheap blinds and the sound of traffic outside. But when he sat up, he knew the truth. He had left her behind, for now, but she remembered. And one day when the bells stopped ringing, she would come again. The world didn't feel the same. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, for what must have been hours, staring at the floor. The sheets tangled around his legs, the daylight shifting slowly across the room. Everything looked normal, his cracked phone screen on the nightstand, the unpaid bills stacked on his dresser, the blinking red light on his answering machine that he never checked anymore. The hum of the city beyond his window filtered in like background noise, horns, footsteps, a distant siren. But none of it felt real, not entirely. It was like walking back into your childhood home and realizing the walls had been painted, the furniture moved, the air different. Familiar, yes, but never the same. He stood slowly, legs trembling not from exhaustion, but from the dissonance of returning. His body remembered things he hadn't lived yet. His skin still carried the memory of roots crawling over it, of the cold breath from the well, of the fire that wasn't fire. He made his way to the bathroom and flicked on the light. The fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, flickering once before settling. He looked into the mirror and froze. Not because he didn't recognize the face staring back, but because it looked too perfect. Too still, too clean. He leaned in. The reflection mimicked his movement, of course, but something in the eyes was off. Not absent. Just delayed. As if the image was thinking before it moved. His hand twitched. The reflection twitched a moment too late. His pulse jumped. Sweat formed on the back of his neck. He reached out and touched the mirror. It was cold, solid, real. But something inside it wasn't. He pulled his hand back and the reflection smiled. He didn't. He stumbled backward, heart pounding. Eyes locked on the image that was now perfectly still. Not mimicking, not moving. Watching. The lights flickered. A whisper filled the room. Soft. Delicate. You brought her home. Ethan snapped his head around. The bathroom was empty. He turned back toward the mirror, and his own face stared back again, normal now, afraid and shaking. Whatever had stared through the glass was gone, but not gone. Not really. He splashed water on his face, trying to convince himself it had all been some stress-induced hallucination. A psychotic break. Sleep deprivation. Something explainable. But that's what she wanted, wasn't it? For him to forget. To doubt. To let the fear dissolve into the routines of the waking world. She didn't need to attack when people were afraid. No. She fed best when they were convinced she wasn't real. When they ignored the scratches at the back of their mind. When they silenced the bells. And there were no bells here. Not in this world. Not in this city. The thought sent a chill through him that no amount of warm water could shake. He left the apartment and stepped into the hallway. It was dead silent. Too silent. He paused. No footsteps. No humming neighbors. No faint blare of a TV. Just quiet. Like the building was holding its breath. The elevator doors opened before he even pressed the button. He stepped in. Pressed lobby. The doors closed. The lights inside flickered. The floor didn't move. He stared at the panel. The numbers didn't change. Nothing moved. Then he noticed the reflection again, in the brushed steel walls of the elevator. This time, there were 3 of him. One behind. One beside. Only one was real. The others were smiling. He didn't turn around, he just closed his eyes. No, he whispered. You don't get in here. The elevator jolted downward with a metallic shriek, nearly knocking him off his feet. The floor display blinked erratically. 43207 101. The doors opened. But it wasn't the lobby. It was the bus. Not as he had last seen it. This time it was new, clean. Empty. Parked in the center of a long, dark tunnel lined with flickering lights. A sound echoed in the distance. A rhythmic clang, iron against stone, and the unmistakable sound of bells. Not one. Dozens. Dozens of bells ringing softly, constantly, overlapping like wind chimes in a storm. He stepped out of the elevator and onto the pavement. The air thick with cold and wet with something that didn't feel like water. The bus door was open. He approached, every step dragging like he was walking through wet cement. Inside the bus, every seat was filled. But not with people. With versions of himself. Every age. Every fear. Him at 6, hiding under a blanket from something in the closet. Him at 17, watching his father's casket being lowered into the ground. Him at 25, screaming as the car rolled over the guardrail. Him at 30, waking up on the real bus the first time. All of them frozen. All of them facing forward. All of them silent. And standing at the front, where the driver should be, was the veiled woman. Her hands were folded, her face hidden. But her posture was calm, composed. Waiting, he didn't speak. He didn't have to. She turned her head toward him, veil fluttering slightly in an unseen breeze. and from her stillness, a single word emerged. Again. Ethan stepped back. "No," he said. "I ended this." She tilted her head. "You paused it." A seat creaked behind him. He turned. One of the versions of himself, older, twisted, stood up, face covered in black veins, mouth sewn shut. It lunged. Ethan fell backward out of the bus and hit the concrete hard. He looked up, and the tunnel was gone. Now he was in his bedroom again, sweating, breathing fast, heartbeat in his throat. The morning light looked unchanged, but something in the walls felt wrong, like they had been watching, recording. He stood, checked the mirror. His reflection looked normal, but it blinked wrong just once. Then it whispered soon. That night, Ethan didn't sleep, not because he didn't try, but because sleep no longer welcomed him the way it used to. Every time he closed his eyes, the silence beneath the world stirred, not with sounds, but with weight. The kind that pressed against the edges of the room, pushed through the cracks in the walls, slipped beneath the sheets. He lay in bed, eyes wide, ears straining for anything normal. Traffic, footsteps from the apartment above, a dog barking down the street. But there was nothing. Just that same unbearable quiet, thick and unnatural. Like the silence that follows a scream in a dream you don't remember waking from. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was knowing it was watching. Not her. No, not just her, but something older. Something she'd let in with her when she slipped into his mind. That feeling of being observed had grown sharper, more focused, like a pinpoint of heat behind his eyes. He caught himself flinching at reflections. He'd see himself move slightly when he hadn't moved at all. A hand twitching in the mirror before his real one did. A blink out of rhythm, and always, a faint smile waiting when he wasn't looking directly at it. By 3:17 a.m., the walls began to sweat, not with water, no, with ink. Thick, black, and slow moving. It bled from the corners of the ceiling, pooled along the baseboards, and ran like molasses across the floor. It didn't smell like anything. It didn't move toward him. It just existed, reminding him that reality was no longer whole. He stood barefoot in the hallway, watching it snake down the walls like veins, his breath coming in shallow pulls. He didn't dare touch it. He didn't dare speak. He knew instinctively that noise would give it shape. Sound gave it power. The apartment door was open. He never left it open. Beyond the threshold wasn't the hallway anymore. The wallpaper was gone. The flickering lights replaced by an endless corridor of old, wooden doors, all identical, spaced evenly like stitches in the skin of something massive and dead. The corridor breathed, slowly. In, out. The air thickened with every inhale. He should have shut the door. Locked it, nailed it shut. But something compelled him forward. He stepped out. The floorboards creaked beneath him, groaning in protest. The doors pulsed faintly, like hearts under glass. As he walked past each one, a whisper reached for him, soft as wind, yet sharp as a needle. Not words, memories. His own, muted versions of his voice, whispering doubts he hadn't let himself say aloud in years. You should have died, not him. You never really woke up. She's still inside you. He stopped in front of the seventh door. Something behind it moved. Slowly, scraping, dragging. Like a body too broken to walk but too angry to stay still. He leaned in, pressing his ear to the wood. A whisper touched the base of his neck, not from the door, but from behind him. She's not behind that one. He turned quickly, but no one was there. Just the corridor, stretching endlessly in both directions. He tried to step away, but the doorknob turned on its own. Not fast. Just enough to let him know the thing behind it was awake. Then came the scratching. Soft at first, feather light, then louder, nails against wood, then pounding. Whatever was on the other side didn't want out. It wanted him in. He backed away, his heel bumping into something solid. The bell. Sitting in the center of the hallway, covered in dust. No rope. No tower. Just the bell waiting. As he stared at it, the doors began to rattle. All of them. At once. like something was trying to push through every single one. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became static, buzzing in his teeth, in his skull. Then the laughter came. Children, adults, voices he knew, voices he didn't. And over it all, her voice, calm, cold, confident. "Open the door, Ethan. You've already crossed the threshold." He turned to run, but the corridor twisted. The doors warped. The floor tilted. Suddenly, gravity didn't matter. He was falling sideways, down, up. It didn't matter. The space around him folded like paper, and he was pulled through it like thread through a needle's eye. Then everything stopped. He stood in a room he didn't recognize. High ceiling, plaster walls, a stained glass window shattered above a rusted metal bed frame. An old hospital room. He stepped closer. His father was in the bed, alive, breathing, hooked to machines that beeped with slow, steady rhythm. And sitting beside the bed was Ethan. Not now Ethan. Younger, hunched, eyes red and hollow. Watching, whispering. Ethan leaned in, trying to hear what his younger self was saying, and then he heard it take me instead. The same words. The bargain. He watched it happen. Not a dream, not a memory, a transaction. And when the machines began to slow, when the breathing became shallow, Ethan saw her. In the corner. Not a veiled woman this time. A nurse, holding a clipboard, smiling faintly. As his father exhaled one last time, she turned to Ethan and mouthed something soon. The world cracked, like glass under pressure. He screamed, not in fear, not in rage, in refusal. A desperate attempt to push her out again, but this time his voice didn't come. His mouth opened. Nothing. And then the nurse stepped forward, grew taller, veil descending from nowhere, her shape shifting. Familiar, endless. Ethan backed into the corner. But there were no corners anymore, just her, and a whisper in the dark, "You never left." Ethan awoke with a gasp, but the air didn't fill his lungs. It sat there, thick and stale, like it had already been breathed 1,000 times. He was lying on the cold, tiled floor of what looked like a hospital corridor, one that hadn't seen light or life in decades. The flickering bulbs overhead buzzed weakly, as if each one was on the edge of giving up. The walls were stained yellow with age, peeling paint hanging like dead skin. Doors lined the hallway, each one shut tightly, no windows, no handles. Just numbered plaques above each frame, some numbers scratched out, others reversed, one upside down. He rose slowly, his joints aching, his throat raw from the scream he never heard. The whisper still echoed inside his head, "You never left." That phrase repeated over and over, like a rot beneath his thoughts. He had screamed in the dream, or the memory, but no sound had come out. And now, even fully awake, his voice felt thinner, distant, like it was echoing from someone else's mouth. He turned around, expecting to see the hospital room, the rusted bed, the broken machines, the thing wearing the nurse's face. But it was gone. Only the hallway stretched before him now, dim and quiet. The silence wasn't total anymore. It had layers. Footsteps, breathing, the soft, rhythmic thud of something wet slapping the floor. Not close, not far, somewhere in between. Somewhere he couldn't avoid. He began to walk. Every step felt wrong, like he was moving through someone else's dream. The hallways twisted subtly, angling upward when they shouldn't, corners bending too far, doors narrowing the further he went. On one wall, he passed a framed photograph, a blurry image of a bell tower under a stormy sky. He leaned closer, and for a flicker of a second, he could swear the clouds moved. Then the photo cracked, spider webbing across the glass. He stepped back and continued, heart pounding. After what felt like miles, he reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood ajar. No plaque, no scratches, just slightly open, a faint light flickering inside. He didn't want to look. He wanted to turn back, to scream for help, to wake up again, truly wake up this time. But something behind him had started moving, not walking, crawling, wet, scraping flesh, dragging across tile, and it was getting closer. He pushed the door open and stepped in. The room was filled with televisions. Dozens, maybe hundreds, stacked wall to wall, each screen playing something different. Some showed grainy footage of his childhood birthday parties, old VHS home videos, classrooms, places he hadn't thought about in years. Others showed things he didn't recognize: a child crying in a mirror, a man walking into a fog-filled lake, a group of pale passengers slowly climbing onto a bus. But one screen in the center pulled his eyes like a magnet. It showed him. Not now. A future version, eyes sunken, face drawn, lips stitched closed, sitting, alone, in the bus, waiting. As he watched, that version of himself slowly turned and stared directly into the camera. Into him. And smiled. Ethan stepped back. The lights in the room began to dim. Screen by screen. He turned to run, but the door was gone. Now it was just walls, solid and unmoving. And then the static came, not loud but constant. A soft hiss that filled the space and seeped into his skin. He pressed his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. It wasn't in the air, it was in him. The static slithered through his thoughts, pushing other memories aside. Faces faded, names blurred. He couldn't remember his mother's voice. Couldn't remember what his old bedroom looked like. Couldn't remember what year it was. The center screen went black, and in white letters it typed a message: "Do you want to forget?" He blinked. Another message followed. "It's easier." His knees buckled. He dropped to the floor, shaking, eyes locked on the flickering text. A third message appeared. "Say yes, and I'll take the rest." And beneath it, faint, almost hidden, "You've already said yes once." His mouth moved. Not on purpose. A whisper he didn't control escaped his lips. And then the TVs turned off, all at once. Darkness swallowed the room. Something touched his back. A hand. No fingers. Just the idea of one. Cold. Heavy. Real. Then a voice. Not hers. Not his. Something in between. She needed the scream. "But I need the silence." Ethan spun, but the room was empty. He was alone again. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he never had been. Suddenly, the wall behind him peeled open like wet paper, revealing another corridor, longer, darker, made entirely of mirrors. Not glass, metal, brushed just enough to reflect shapes. The corridor pulsed with a low sound, like a heartbeat played backward, and down at the very end, something was watching him. Not a figure, a shape, an outline, human but hollow, and it wore a bell around its neck. The bell didn't ring, it pulsed, with light, with memory, with hunger. And Ethan knew that whatever waited at the end of that hallway, it wasn't her, it was worse. She'd led him here, yes, but she hadn't followed him in, because she feared this thing, this silence, this absence. And now he was walking straight into it. The mirrors whispered as he passed. Not voices, not thoughts, just sounds. Footsteps that weren't his, breaths that came too close, shadows that moved one frame too late. Each reflection twisted a little more, until they no longer mirrored him. One showed him without eyes. One showed him hanging from the bell tower. One showed him sleeping in a hospital bed, the world crumbling outside the window. But he didn't stop. He couldn't, because the shape at the end had started to move, and now it was ringing the bell, softly, slowly, calling something forward. And it wasn't Ethan's name this time. It was his father's. And then, behind that, his own. The sound of the bell wasn't like the others. It didn't shake the air or rattle the ground. It was subtle, barely louder than a breath. But it carried weight, like something buried in the tone reached into Ethan's chest and squeezed. Each ring was precise, deliberate, and spaced far enough apart that the silence between them became unbearable. It was as if the sound wasn't calling someone, but undoing them, and with each chime, Ethan's name rang louder inside his skull, not shouted, not whispered, just repeated. Flat, inevitable. Like a death sentence written on a loop. He kept moving down the corridor, the mirror, walls warping more with every step. Now they didn't just reflect him. They anticipated him. His reflection would flinch before he did, tilt its head before he even thought about it. The corridor seemed to stretch the deeper he walked, and though the bell's source remained small in the distance, it was unmistakably moving toward him too. Two things being drawn together by something older than will, older than names. His breath fogged the air. The corridor was growing cold, not freezing but hollow, a vacuum cold. The kind that suggested something had recently left the world, or was about to. The silence between the bells grew longer, and then the sound stopped entirely. No ringing, no hum, and then the whisper returned. "You don't remember the trade?" Ethan froze. Not because the voice startled him, but because he did remember, or something close to it. Not one memory, but fragments. He saw his younger self again. That same night, that same hospital. But this time, the room was different. His father wasn't alone. There had been another figure there, hidden in the corner, unmoving, like it had always been there, even when he hadn't noticed it. A dark silhouette, no face, no gender, no voice. It had offered him something, a way to take the pain away, to silence the nightmares, to erase the guilt, and he had said yes, not to save his father, not to die in his place, but to forget. Ethan stumbled. His hand pressed against the mirror wall to steady himself, and his reflection laughed. Not just a twitch of the mouth, full, delighted laughter. It grinned with blackened teeth, and behind its eyes burned 1,000 bells tolling in unison. The moment he touched the glass, it rippled, soft like water, and then pulled. His arm sank in up to the elbow before he yanked it back with a cry. A smear of black tar clung to his skin. It moved. It climbed. He scraped at it with his other hand, panicking, trying to wipe it off, but it slid across his flesh like oil on ice. It didn't burn. It froze. His skin beneath it went pale, then gray, and the longer it stayed, the less he could feel that part of himself. A sound rose behind him. Not a bell. Footsteps. Heavy, dragging. He turned, and there it was. The one from the hospital room. The one from the memory. It had no face. No features. Just a robe of darkness that moved like smoke, and the bell around its neck, now glowing faintly red. Its hands were not hands. They were outlines, constantly shifting. Sometimes claws, sometimes fingers, sometimes chains. Ethan stepped back, but the figure didn't follow with its body. Only the sound followed. A second bell began to ring. Then a third. And then all the mirrors around him cracked, just slightly, but all at once. From each crack, a whisper bled out. "You gave her your scream. You gave me the rest." The figure raised one hand, and the corridor folded. Not physically, but mentally. Ethan felt his thoughts compress, like paper being crushed in a fist. Memories bled out through his eyes, his ears. He saw moments of his life replaying in the mirrors, disjointed, out of order. The first nightmare he ever had. The moment his father looked at him with disappointment. The first time he woke up on the bus. The last time he said his name out loud. It was all being taken. He dropped to his knees, clutching his skull. No, 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 no. This isn't happening. I ended this. I burned her. I won. The figure's bell rang again. And suddenly Ethan was back on the bus, seat 17. Looking out the window. The passengers were still. The driver wasn't moving. Everything was exactly as it had been the first time. But he knew this wasn't the beginning. This was the echo, a copy of a copy. He turned to the window and saw his reflection, smiling. Not like the others. This one was patient, and behind it stood the figure. It rested a hand on his shoulder in the reflection. Ethan spun, but no one was there. Then the bus engine growled to life. The lights flickered, the doors hissed shut, and the bell began to ring from inside the engine. Not to warn, not to protect, but to collect. He screamed, but no sound came out. Because that scream, it wasn't his anymore. She had it. The thing in the veil. But now something else had the rest. Something that fed not on fear or names, but on everything left after. And as the bus rolled forward, deeper into the place that should not exist, Ethan understood the most horrifying truth of all. He hadn't escaped. He hadn't survived. He hadn't won. He'd only changed hands. The bus moved without sound now. Not the mechanical rumble he'd grown used to. Not even the faint hum of tires on earth. It was gliding through something that no longer resembled space. Through a tunnel without walls. Through a world that didn't seem built for matter, but memory. The windows no longer showed trees or streets or ruined towns. Instead, they showed him thousands of versions. In school, in bed, in pain, in fear, crying, screaming, sometimes younger, sometimes impossibly old, all of them trapped in looping fragments of his past, all of them turning to stare at him as he passed, as if they'd been waiting for him to catch up. Ethan couldn't move. His arms were numb. His legs might as well have been stone. He was still seated in 17A, and the bus, now long since changed into something else entirely, wasn't taking him anywhere. It was showing him, teaching him, reminding him. Every minute dragged like a hook through his brain, dredging up things he'd buried so deep he thought they'd never see light again. The driver still hadn't turned. That blank figure slumped forward, hands gripping the wheel, not out of control, but out of ritual. As if the act of driving was the only thing keeping this world from collapsing entirely. Or maybe it was the very thing that kept it going. The engine wasn't powered by fuel. It was powered by repetition. And Ethan had repeated this ride before. How many times? He didn't know anymore. All the memories were starting to blur. Past, present, dream, death. Each loop felt more like a smudged copy of the last, less clear, less real. Except for one thing. The bell. That damned bell. Every few minutes it would ring again. Once. Always once. Loud enough to make the lights flicker. And with every chime, something was taken. He didn't remember his mother's name anymore. It had just gone. Like the bell had stolen it and replaced it with silence. He gritted his teeth. He couldn't let it go on like this. He couldn't just sit and let himself be erased piece by piece, name by name, thought by thought. He needed to fight. But how do you fight something you can't touch? Something that hides inside sound. Inside you. Then the lights in the bus shifted. A soft red glow seeped in through the floor, bleeding up the seats, across the walls, until the entire interior was cast in the color of blood and fire. And with it came heat. The kind that doesn't burn skin. It burns memory. Ethan felt his thoughts blistering, melting, parts of himself slipping away before he could hold them. His name felt thinner now. His sense of self was pulling apart. Then, a shape, a woman, walking slowly down the aisle. No veil this time, no disguises, just her. Wearing every version of every face he'd ever seen her in. Each one shifting over the next, like skin being peeled and replaced. She stopped at his row. Didn't speak. She didn't have to. The bell rang again. This time, it came from her throat. She opened her mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't a tone. It was a scream. His scream. Not the physical sound of pain, but the moment of it. The sound of what he had felt at the exact instant he'd said yes to the dark offer in the hospital. The instant he gave up everything just to stop feeling. The scream filled the bus. All the passengers turned, and they were him again. All versions, all futures, all regrets. They rose, mouths open, eyes blank. They began walking toward him. He tried to move, but the heat had locked him in place. The woman reached out, not quickly, not with malice. She touched his chest, lightly, and in that moment he was inside her. Not physically, mentally. Dragged into the storm that lived behind her eyes, he saw everything. The original town centuries before it was built. A pit in the earth. A hole that no one could fill. A sound that escaped it. A bell, hammered from the ore around the pit. Designed to mimic the sound of the thing's heartbeat. They thought it could hold her. They were wrong. Over time, people stopped remembering why the bell rang. They rang it anyway, until one day it stopped. And when it did, she walked. She wore faces. She took names. She fed on the screams of those too afraid to remember what they'd offered. And she'd been following him ever since that moment in the hospital room. where grief made him reckless, where fear made him weak, where he'd said yes because he couldn't bear the silence anymore. And now she wanted payment, but not in death, not in blood, in removal. Erasure. To take every version of him and empty it out, leave nothing behind but a face she could wear. And the most horrific part, she already had most of him. He had said yes, and once you said yes, you couldn't take it back. Unless his thoughts pierced the fog. The bell, it could lock her in. That's what the old town believed, right? That the bell could keep her contained. But not one bell. That's why she kept ringing it. Why she was the bell now. She needed to be heard in pieces, so she wouldn't collapse. If he could find a way to silence it completely, then maybe, just maybe, he could trap her again. But the risk, if he silenced her completely, he'd silence himself with her, and no one would remember he ever existed. Not even him. She smiled. She saw the thought. She approved. Ethan forced his body to move, lifted one arm, reached out, and touched her throat. The bell inside it pulsed against his fingers, warm, alive, humming with 1,000 screams. And he did what he never thought he could. He ripped it out. Her mouth opened in shock. No sound. No scream. Just silence. Pure blinding, absolute silence. The lights shattered. The bus exploded outward, not in fire, but in memory. A burst of color, of people, of pain and joy and voices, all torn apart and scattered into darkness. And then, nothing. Black, quiet, weightless. Ethan drifted in it. No pain, no thought, no name. Just a toll. Not from her, but from him. He had become the bell. And someone somewhere would ring it again. When awareness returned, it wasn't like waking up. It was like being poured into something. Ethan found himself standing, not floating, not lying, but standing, in a space that had no edges. At first it was black, then gray, then white, then every color and none, shifting like oil on water. He was alone. No bus, no bell, no passengers, no forest, just himself, or what was left of himself. He looked down. His hands were translucent. Through his fingers, faint pinpricks of light flickered like dying stars. He wasn't flesh anymore. He wasn't even thought. He was a remainder, a shape left behind after a scream has ended. And somewhere far off, muffled by distance and memory, he heard a sound. Not the toll of the bell, but the absence of it. A silence so deep it bent the space around him. Then, slowly, the silence shaped itself into a corridor. Stone underfoot, walls slick with moisture. No doors this time, just arches, one after another, like a throat swallowing him deeper. He walked because walking was all he could do. Each step echoed without echo, a hollow clap in a place that should have been endless, but felt smaller with every breath. He came to an opening. And there, at the center of a vast cavern, stood the well. Not the cracked mossy thing he'd seen before. This was the original, perfectly round, carved from stone so black it drank the light. Around it stood figures, not people, not ghosts, but shapes like shadows drawn in charcoal. They faced the well, heads bowed. None moved, none breathed. Ethan stepped closer and realized the figures weren't standing. They were hanging, their feet inches above the ground. Each one strung up by a rope that disappeared into the darkness above. Ropes that didn't sway, ropes that looked more like veins than fiber, and as he passed them, he saw their faces, his faces, every version of him, hundreds, thousands. All the versions she'd worn, all the selves she'd hollowed, suspended here like marionettes waiting for a hand to twitch the strings. The sound of water dripped from the well. No blood. A single drop, over and over, and with each drop came a whisper. Ring the bell. He stepped to the edge of the well and looked down. Darkness stared back, not empty, alive, breathing. And then a shape rose. Not her, not quite. A reflection of him built from everything he'd lost. The boy from the hospital, the man from the mirror, the scream from the bus, all fused together. It climbed the inner wall like a spider, eyes glowing faint white. When it spoke, its voice was his, but hollowed out. "You're not free," it said. You only changed your cage. Ethan backed up. I took it from her. I silenced her. You silenced a bell, it whispered. Not the mouth that rang it. He clenched his fists. Then how do I stop this? The figure tilted its head, a grotesque mirror of his own posture. You don't. You end it. Completely. It gestured upward, and Ethan looked. High above, where the ropes vanished into darkness, a single bell hung, massive, black, carved with the same marks he'd seen scratched into the church walls. It was older than anything, older than the town, older than her. It pulsed faintly, a heartbeat in metal. You've been ringing it since you said yes, the hollow, Ethan said. Every scream, every memory, every name, each toll keeps her alive. Each toll keeps you in the loop. Ethan stared at the bell and understood. It wasn't a tool. It was a heart. Hers, his, both. If you break it, the hollow, Ethan whispered, you don't trap her. You don't survive her. You erase her. And everything she's ever touched. You included. Ethan's stomach dropped. I'll die. You'll vanish, the hollow, Ethan corrected. No memory. No face. No echo. Not even silence. Just gone. Ethan's hands trembled. He'd fought through the town, the forest, the bus, the corridor. All of it to claw his way back to himself. And now the only way out was to destroy the one thing that still tied him to reality. But as he stared at the bell, he thought of his father, of the bargain, of the girl who'd helped him even when she was already lost. He couldn't let her, or any of them, become another cycle. He stepped toward the well. The ropes above him trembled. The bell's pulse quickened. The hollow Ethan smiled. She's waiting. Ethan gritted his teeth and spoke, his voice steady for the first time in what felt like lifetimes. I'm not ringing it anymore. He reached upward and climbed. The cavern roared. The hanging versions of himself twitched, eyes snapping open, mouths opening in silent screams as he passed them. The ropes coiled tighter, writhing like snakes, trying to pull him back. But he climbed faster, hands bleeding light instead of blood. The bell loomed closer, its surface etched with every name she'd ever taken, every scream she'd ever fed on. His father's name was there. The girl's, his own. He reached the top. The bell swung once, a slow arc that moved the air like a hurricane. He wrapped his arms around it. It was warm, alive, beating, and he whispered, not a scream, not a bargain, but a goodbye. Then he pulled, hard, and the bell cracked, a hairline fracture at first, then another. Then a sound that wasn't a toll but a wail, the wail of something being torn out of the world. The cavern shook. The ropes snapped. The hanging versions of himself dissolved into ash. The hollow Ethan below screamed and collapsed into the well, torn apart by the void rising from it. And the bell broke, not in pieces, into nothing. And with it, everything began to go. The cavern faded. The well crumbled. The ropes unraveled. The shadows vanished, and Ethan felt himself slipping. Not falling, not dying, just ceasing. He closed his eyes and let go. And then a single sound. A heartbeat. Not hers, not his something new. A voice whispering in the dark, wake up. He gasped, violently, as if surfacing from beneath miles of dark water, and air rushed into his lungs like fire. The world snapped into focus all at once. Blinding light, sharp smells, cold sheets, distant beeping, a soft murmur of voices. He wasn't underground, not in the forest, not on the bus. He was in a bed, a hospital bed. Fluorescent lights buzzed above. The ceiling tiles were off white, some stained with age. Beside him, a machine beeped steadily, sensing with the rapid, chaotic rhythm of his own heartbeat. His fingers twitched. He felt the IV needle taped into his arm. The ache in his muscles wasn't imagined. It was real. Tangible. Every nerve, every breath, every blinking light on the monitor screamed reality. He turned his head slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. A nurse stood nearby, back turned, writing something on a clipboard. She hadn't noticed he was awake yet, but someone else had, his father, sitting in the chair by the window, alive, older, tired, but undeniably there. Ethan froze. The air caught in his throat. The man looked up, met his eyes, and smiled. "Hey, kiddo," he said, voice soft, hoarse. "You're back." Ethan couldn't speak. His mouth opened, but no words came. Not out of fear, not out of silence, out of disbelief. He had seen his father die, had mourned him, had traded something in that moment. So how was he here? The nurse turned, and when she saw his eyes open, she gasped, dropped the clipboard, ran to the door calling for a doctor. Her voice faded into the hallway, but Ethan barely heard it. All he could hear was the static in his head beginning to rise again. That hum. That distant, low bell hidden beneath the noise of the real world. No, not again. He tried to sit up, and his father rushed to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Easy, don't move too fast. You've been out a long time." "How?" Ethan croaked, the word like sandpaper. His father leaned in. "They said you flatlined for almost 5 minutes. But then, your heart just came back. No reason. No warning. Just back." Ethan stared at him. "Where?" he began, his voice struggling. "Where am I?" "Say, Lydia's. Same hospital. The one I—" His father stopped. His eyes lowered for a second, then looked back up. "It doesn't matter. What matters is you're here now." The words were comforting. Too comforting. Ethan's eyes scanned the room. Everything looked normal, sterile, real. But the window, the light coming through it was wrong. Not artificial. Not sunlight either. It shimmered slightly, like heat rising off asphalt. And beyond it, the world outside didn't look like the city. There were trees. Too many. And they moved without wind. His father followed his gaze.
"Yeah, I see it too."
That sentence struck him harder than any scream. "What?" Ethan rasped. His father's face darkened. "I don't think we ever left, Ethan." The machines around him began to pulse louder, faster. His mind reeled. "But—" he tried to protest, but his father raised a hand. "They gave you something to believe. A moment. A breath. A goodbye." Ethan's throat tightened. "The bell. I broke it." "You broke one," his father said. "But that wasn't the heart. That was hers." "Not its." Ethan froze. "What are you saying?" His father leaned closer, and in the reflection of the window behind him, Ethan saw it. The bell tower, still standing, not ruined, not cracked, but whole, waiting. "Son," his father said gently, "you didn't reach the surface. You just reached another layer." Ethan's eyes burned. He looked down at his hands, still fading slightly at the edges, still not entirely real. "You're part of it now," his father said. "So am I." Everyone who ever whispered a yes, everyone who ever screamed, everyone who ever gave even a moment of silence. They're all part of it. Ethan shook his head. "No, I ended it. I ended her." His father nodded. "You did." But she was only the voice, not the mouth, not the echo. A silence stretched between them. And then his father spoke the truth Ethan hadn't dared to consider. She wasn't the origin, Ethan. She was the warning. Outside the window, the trees bent forward. A shadow passed over the hospital. A sound began to build in the distance. Not a bell, not a scream, a heartbeat. One that didn't come from a person. One that surrounded, below, beneath everything. Ethan looked up at his father, whose eyes now shimmered faintly. "Like mirrors. You need to wake up," his father whispered. "I am awake." "No, not yet." The machines around him began to distort. The beeping warbled. The heart monitor went flat, but the pulse didn't stop. It deepened, became a vibration in the floor, in the bed, in his spine. The room shook. The nurse was gone. The door faded, and the walls peeled away like skin sloughing from bone. And then he was alone again, in a chair, in a room, in front of a mirror. A sign above it read WHO Do Wo Utai Kiyo UR, and beneath the mirror, etched in the glass, the bell doesn't stop. It just changes hands. Behind the mirror, something breathed, waiting, watching, ready to ring again. The breath behind the mirror wasn't human. It wasn't even pretending to be. Ethan sat frozen in the chair, his reflection staring back at him. But it was no longer just a reflection. It was a question, a mocking, shifting thing. His face changed subtly every few seconds. A wider smile, a flicker in the eyes, a tilt of the head that didn't match his real movement. The thing in the glass was studying him, waiting to see what he'd do next. And behind it, the breathing continued, slow, steady, deliberate. Like something just beyond the surface was timing him, measuring how long it would take for him to break again. He reached toward the mirror, expecting it to be cool glass, but the moment his fingertips touched it, the surface rippled. Not like water, more like skin. Warm, pulsing, alive. He pulled back, heart hammering. The question above the mirror glared down at him, "Who? Dio ya yutan you are." The words didn't feel rhetorical. They were literal. A test, a threshold. He stood up from the chair. His legs didn't ache anymore. No IVs, no hospital hum, no remnants of the world that had lulled him into the illusion of waking. Just this room, this pulsing mirror, and the voice behind it. Or rather, the thing that wore voice like clothing. And then it spoke, not from the mirror, from everywhere. "You've rung the bell." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You've stepped through the threshold. You've faced the scream. You've held the silence. And still you ask, where does it end?" He didn't respond. The voice didn't expect him to. "You broke her," it continued, not angry, not pleased, just stating fact. But she was only a rung on the chain. The chain around the bell in the deep. Ethan felt his chest tighten. His mind darted through the places he'd been. The town, the forest, the corridor, the bus, the cave, the hospital. Each one a layer, not separate but stacked, like pages in a book. He'd been turning through them, page after page, believing each one was the last. But he had never reached the end. Because there wasn't one. Not until he answered. Not until he claimed something. "You can leave," the voice whispered, closer now, just over his shoulder. Not the world, not the curse, but the seat. He turned. Behind him was another chair, wooden, old. At the base of the chair, an object, a bell, small, cracked, unassuming, but humming, waiting. He stared at it. "No," he whispered. "I'm not ringing it again. You don't have to," the voice replied. And then the mirror changed. It no longer showed his reflection. It showed her, the veiled woman, burned, broken, but alive, trapped behind glass. Her hands clawed at the inside of the mirror. And she was screaming, but no sound came out. She mouthed something over and over, "It's your turn." Ethan staggered back. The room darkened. The mirror expanded. The question above it pulsed brighter, "Who tine puari." He understood now. It wasn't asking for a name. It wasn't asking for a role. It was asking for intent. Because whoever answered that question became the next bellkeeper. And that bell on the floor, it was the last. The root. The first sound carved into the base of silence. He had a choice. Sit. Take the bell. Hold the line. Keep the scream locked away. Forever. Or he could walk. Let it ring. Let the world burn. Let the chain break. He stared at the bell. His fingers curled into fists. The veiled woman behind the mirror was mouthing faster now. Pleading. Her image blurred. And now he saw them. All of them. Behind the glass. Every soul she had taken. The children. The passengers. The man with the stitched mouth. The girl who tried to help him. Even his father. All behind the mirror. Screaming without sound. Locked behind a bell that would never stop unless someone sat in the chair. Unless someone took the weight. Ethan looked down. At his hands. Still trembling. But real. He walked to the chair. Sat down. The room went still. The mirror shimmered. The voice behind him sighed. Not in relief. Not in victory. In acceptance. "Now you understand." He picked up the bell. It felt cold. Then warm. Then alive. It didn't need to ring. It just needed to be held. To be watched. To be remembered. Because the moment it was forgotten, the scream would return. The silence would fracture. And the cycle would begin again. He closed his eyes. And the question above the mirror slowly faded, replaced by a new one. Will you be? Quam. He didn't have the answer yet. But now he had time. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, Ethan had time. Time passed. Not in seconds or minutes or any way Ethan had once known it. In this place, time flowed like a thought, shifting, folding, sometimes stalling altogether. He sat in the chair, the bell in his lap, unmoving. The room around him no longer pulsed. It had grown quiet, still. The mirror across from him no longer reflected anything. It had turned dark, flat, like the surface of a pond at night. But behind it, beneath it, he could still feel them. The ones who had screamed. The ones who had said yes. The ones who had rung the bell before him. And though their faces were now distant, their presence clung to the edges of this place, waiting. Watching. Hoping, maybe, that he'd last longer than they had. He didn't know how long he'd been here. Hours. Days. Years. Maybe all of them. Maybe none. It didn't matter. The silence was both unbearable and familiar now, like a song with no end, looping endlessly in the background of his mind. And the bell, this final, ancient bell, had grown heavier in his hands. Not physically, but spiritually. Every second he held it, he could feel it binding to him, carving itself into his shape, taking root in the folds of his memory. Then, something shifted. It began as a chill. Barely there. A thread of cold creeping through the warmth he'd grown used to. At first, he thought it was his own fatigue, the erosion of his will, the start of his end. But no, this was outside him, new, unfamiliar. The air around the chair darkened. The silence thickened, and the mirror began to flicker, not with light, with images. They appeared one by one, like watercolors bleeding into fabric. A woman, not the veiled one, someone else, young, pale, shaking, standing in a room he didn't recognize. She was staring at something off screen, and though no sound came through, her expression said everything. Fear, recognition. She reached toward something, toward a box, a small, dusty box. She opened it, and inside sat a bell. No, not the bell, a piece of it, a shard. Ethan bolted upright. The room jolted with him, as if reacting to the shift in his focus. The mirror flashed again, another image. The same woman, now running down a street. The sky above her was sickly green, trees bent the wrong way. A town in collapse. The town, the one he'd escaped. Except he hadn't. Because it hadn't ended, it had fractured. And the bell, his bell, wasn't the only piece left. There were more. Pieces scattered across layers of the world, hidden in people, in places, in willingness. The realization hit him like a drop of ice down his spine. He hadn't destroyed the cycle. He'd only paused it. The woman appeared again, closer this time, and then her mouth moved. This time, there was sound, not from her, but around him, through the walls, through the air. One word, Ethan. He froze. He hadn't heard his name in what felt like forever. Not like this. Not from out there. He clutched the bell in his lap. The silence around him strained, pulled thin, and then tore. The room collapsed, not into darkness, into echo. Layer upon layer of sound, crashing into his mind, unraveling the careful stillness he'd built. He stood. The chair vanished beneath him. The mirror cracked, once, twice, then shattered, and on the other side was the world. Real. Open. Bleeding. He stepped through. The light burned, but he didn't stop. The bell in his hand hummed with energy. And the air beyond the mirror welcomed him like a storm welcomes thunder. He was standing in the middle of a street, but not his street. A different place. Cracks split the pavement. Windows were boarded. Signs flickered. And the sky was wrong again. Red streaks slashed across it like fresh wounds. And down the block, the woman from the mirror, still holding the box, still staring at him like he shouldn't exist. He took a step forward. She backed up. "No," she said aloud now. "You're not supposed to be here." "You were?" She stopped. And he saw it in her eyes. Recognition. She'd seen him before. Not in dreams. Not in visions. In history. She turned and ran. He followed. The bell pulsed harder with each step. The town warped around him. Houses stretching taller than they should. Streets that doubled back on themselves. Doors that whispered as he passed. The town knew him. It remembered. And now it feared him. Because he wasn't just Ethan anymore. He was Keeper. and he had brought the bell with him. The woman vanished into a chapel at the end of the block. A crumbling, rotted chapel. Its steeple gone, its cross rusted, but still something familiar. He entered without hesitation, and there she was, at the altar, behind her, a wall covered in drawings, not scribbles, maps, symbols, the same symbols etched into the old bell. She spun to face him. Box clutched to her chest. "Why are you here?" she hissed. "You broke it. You shouldn't be able to come back." "I didn't break it," Ethan said. His voice was stronger now, like the silence had made it sharper. "I became it." Her eyes widened. The box trembled in her hands. "You don't understand what you're holding," he said. "I do," she whispered. "It called to me. It chose me." He stepped forward. "It doesn't choose. It waits." She held the box tighter. "I can stop it," she said. "I can finish what you didn't." Ethan stopped just feet from her. "You can't stop what you haven't heard." He reached out slowly. She looked down at the box. Opened it. The shard sat there, faintly glowing, and then she lifted it. A tiny, broken bell fragment, cracked, but still humming, still alive, the same tone as his. He saw her arm twitch. She was going to ring it. He lunged forward, but it was too late. The shard sang, not loud, not sharp, just once, a note. But that one sound shattered the chapel and opened everything. The sound shouldn't have been that loud. It shouldn't have had the power to rupture stone, to tear through time, to reach inside the mind and twist. But that single chime, born from the broken shard in the woman's trembling hand, did more than echo. It pierced. It bled through the cracks between this world and the next, through memory, through silence, through every space Ethan had fought to hold together. And in the instant it rang, the air around them didn't explode. It turned, folded inward. The chapel didn't collapse. It reversed, each board and nail unbuilding itself into fragments of wood and rust and dust. Gravity flickered. Ethan's feet lost their place on the floor, and the room spun around a center that didn't seem to exist anymore. He landed hard on dirt, not wood, not stone. Dirt, cold, damp, old. He was underground again, but not in a tunnel, not in the corridor of silence. This was older, rawer. A chamber carved into the bones of the earth, not by hands but by intention. Shapes pulsed in the walls, faint impressions like screams frozen in mud. The ceiling arched into darkness. Roots hung down, twitching as if aware. The woman fell beside him, gasping, the box still clutched to her chest. She looked at him in horror. What is this?" Ethan didn't answer. He already knew. This was where the first bell was made. This was where it had all begun. Not in the town, not in the chapel, but here, beneath. He stood slowly, bell still clutched tight in his hand. It vibrated wildly now, like it was afraid. Or, maybe, angry, and the shard in the woman's box had changed. It pulsed like a heartbeat now, light crawling along its fractured edge. Something responded from the darkness. A breath, heavy, drawn in over centuries. Then, footsteps. Not many, just one slow, measured, dragging. Ethan stepped in front of the woman instinctively, eyes locked on the passage beyond the chamber. Shadows shifted, stone cracked, and then it appeared. Not a person, not a shape, an absence. A piece of the world that didn't exist the same way everything else did. Like a hole someone forgot to fill. But somehow Ethan knew what it meant. It was the first bell ringer. Not a man, not a god. Something that had never needed to be named. It didn't wear a face. It took them. And as it moved, the bells in both Ethan's and the woman's hands began to tremble. The woman cried out, "What is that?" "The beginning," Ethan said, barely a whisper. The one who rang the first silence. It drew closer. The earth around them groaned with every step. Ethan realized it wasn't moving toward them. It was moving toward the bells. It wanted to collect the pieces, reform the whole, ring again, and this time not just one world would hear. He turned to the woman. "We can't let it take the shard." She shook her head, frozen. "I didn't know. I thought it would give me peace." Ethan felt a pang, not of sympathy, of recognition. He'd thought the same thing. But peace had a cost. And if the bell was whole again, there would be no silence left in the world. Only sound. Unstoppable. Unending. The bell in his hand cracked. A fine fracture split the surface. Not damage, response. It was waking up. Choosing. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between the void thing and the woman. It paused. No eyes. But he felt its attention. The sound it made wasn't a growl. It was a question. A pull. An invitation. Give me the tone. Ethan's body went cold. Not from fear, from recognition. This thing had spoken to him before. Long ago. Before the hospital. Before the deal. In dreams. In the gaps between memories. It had offered him the bell. And he had accepted. Not knowing what it meant. Now, it had come to collect. He gritted his teeth and raised the bell. It hummed louder. The thing leaned closer, waiting. Ethan didn't speak. He closed his eyes. And for the first time, he listened. Not to the bell. Not to the scream. To the space between them, the silence. And there, it was still there, buried deep. A thread thin. Real. He reached for it with everything he had left. And pulled. The bell shattered in his hand. Not into dust. Into light. The scream that followed wasn't pain. It was release. The thing recoiled. Shrank. The chamber trembled. The ground buckled. The woman screamed. Ethan turned, grabbed the shard from her box, and crushed it in his palm. The light expanded. The void howled. And then, nothing. Not silence. Not darkness. Just nothing. A clean slate. An empty space. And in that space, Ethan stood alone. Not dead. Not whole. Something else. He no longer held the bell. He was the bell. Or what was left of it. And in the stillness, he understood you can't kill a sound. But you can hold it. You can trap it. You can become its cage. The world would go on. The woman would wake. The town would mend. And the scream would wait. Behind eyes. Behind memory. Behind silence. Until someone else said yes. For a moment, Ethan believed it was over. Not just the fight, but everything. The scream had gone quiet. The bell was gone. The chamber had collapsed into white, and the world behind his eyes stretched into a soft void. No time. No pain. No weight. He stood in that space like a figure on the last page of a book, unsure if the story had ended or if the ink had simply run out. The silence didn't press against him like before. It didn't suffocate or creep. It simply was. A living stillness that expected nothing from him. And then, from somewhere deep within that blank space, he heard footsteps. Soft. Deliberate. Coming toward him, he turned, even though the void had no direction, and saw someone emerging through the white. A figure. Human. Not cloaked in shadows. Not wrapped in screams. Just a girl. The same girl from before. The one who'd tried to help him in the forest. The one who'd burned away in front of him. But now, she looked different. Clearer. Real. Her hair hung over one eye, and she wore the same expression she had when she first told him to run. Not out of fear, but out of knowing. You held it longer than anyone, she said, her voice calm. Most break before the bell cracks. You didn't. Ethan's throat was dry. I thought you were gone. She nodded. I was, but not completely. No one ever really leaves a scream, especially one they chose. He took a step closer. Then where are we? She looked around. This is the pause. The place between tones. Where sound hasn't been born yet. Where the bell waits to be remembered. Ethan felt something stir in his chest. Not a pulse. Not fear. Something older. A tension just beneath the skin, like pressure building before a storm. Did I stop it? He asked. The girl tilted her head. You stopped this one. You scattered the bell. Broke the rhythm. Delayed the echo. But stopping it. That's not what the bell does, he frowned. Then what does it do? It remembers. Behind them, the white began to peel. Not violently, slowly, like curtains lifting on a stage. Beyond the white, the town, the forest, the bus, the corridor, but all of it frozen in mid-moment, like wax figures left in motion. And somewhere far in the distance, faint but growing louder, the low, steady thrum of another bell. Ethan turned, heart sinking. There's another. There always is, she said. When one tone breaks, another begins. The bell never stops. It just looks for someone else to hold it. He looked down at his hands. They were empty now. No weight, no glow. But the imprint remained, faint marks etched into his skin like a forgotten melody. He clenched his fists. So what? All of this just keeps going. We fight, we break, we forget, and then it starts again. She nodded, slowly. Unless someone remembers. That's the only way to change the sound, not by silence, but by memory. Ethan stared into the frozen world. What happens if I walk back in? You risk becoming the bell again, she said. Risk holding it too long. Risk forgetting your own name in its echo. He looked at her. And if I stay here? She smiled sadly. Then you let the next scream come without warning. Silence stretched between them, not empty. Full. Heavy with choice. Ethan looked back at the frozen town. The chapel suspended mid-collapse. The street mid-scream. The hospital room mid-whisper. And then he saw something else. A boy. Young. Curled on the floor of a hospital hallway. Shaking. Muttering. His name. Not Ethan. His original name. Before the bell. Before the trade. He remembered the night. The offer. The thing in the dark corner of the hospital room. He had said yes. But the boy on the floor hadn't yet. Not yet. Ethan turned to the girl. You said memory can change the sound. She nodded. Then let me show him. Let me warn myself. Her eyes widened. You'd go back to that moment. He nodded. No scream yet. No bell. Just a chance. The void trembled. Not in resistance. In response. As if the scream itself was listening. Waiting. You'll have to fight for that moment, she whispered. It's buried under everything. Even the silence. He stepped forward. I've fought worse. The frozen world cracked. The thrum in the distance grew louder. And suddenly, he was falling again. Not into darkness, not into memory, but into a single moment in time. That hallway. That boy. That version of himself, so small and scared, tucked against the wall, shaking as the bell began to whisper beneath his thoughts. Ethan stood at the far end, watching himself, and then he took a step forward. The boy didn't look up. But Ethan knelt beside him, placed a hand on the cold tile. Hey, he whispered. You don't have to say yes. The boy trembled. It hurts, he whimpered. It won't stop hurting. Ethan nodded. I know. It'll try to take that hurt. But it doesn't give anything back. The boy slowly looked up. Same eyes. Same fear. Same seed of the scream, waiting to bloom. But what if I want to forget? Ethan smiled. Not cruel. Not broken. Just tired. If you forget, he said, you become the bell. The air shifted. A new tone started to rise. Slow. Inevitable. But Ethan held firm. You don't have to say yes, he repeated. And the boy didn't. He said nothing. No whisper. No bargain. Just silence. And in that silence, the tone faltered. The rhythm broke. Somewhere far away, the original bell cracked, and the world blinked. The world didn't shatter. It shifted. Subtly. Like a house settling in the night. Ethan blinked, and everything around him warped in that quiet, decisive instant. The hospital corridor faded. Its sterile glow replaced by soft, natural light filtering through old glass windows. The hum of fluorescent bulbs was gone. In its place was birdsong, distant, faint, real. The kind of sound the bell had always drowned out. He stood slowly, heart pounding. Eyes scanning a hallway he hadn't seen in years. It wasn't the hospital anymore. Not the cursed one. It was his house. His childhood home. Clean, silent, peaceful. He turned in a slow circle, disoriented by the sudden calm. The walls were lined with old photographs. Dust-free. The carpet beneath his feet was rough, like it always had been. The sun warmed the hallway, and the air smelled like morning. No screaming. No bells. No shadowed corners waiting to bargain, and no version of himself curled up in fear. Ethan took a breath that didn't shake. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, he wasn't afraid. But that's when the question came. Soft, almost hidden in the back of his mind. What had changed? He'd gone back, warned his younger self, prevented the deal, stopped the first thread of the scream from pulling taut. But he knew better than to believe something so old, so patient, would simply vanish because he said no. The bell was more than sound, more than a curse. It was expectation. It waited, and if Ethan hadn't taken its place, if he hadn't said yes, then who had? A sharp knock broke the silence, not from inside the house, from the front door. He froze. 3 knocks, rhythmic, measured, deliberate. He moved slowly, each step down the hall a return to something he couldn't quite place. He passed the kitchen, still intact. The living room, frozen in a perfect moment of comfort, his mother's old mug resting on the coffee table, a blanket folded neatly over the couch arm, nothing out of place. But as he reached the front door, he noticed it. The doorknob, polished silver, but now tarnished slightly around the edges, not worn from use, burned. Ethan swallowed hard. He put his ear to the wood silence. He opened the door. No one. Just the yard, the trees, the empty street. But something was off. The mailbox at the end of the walkway had been split clean down the middle. Not smashed. Sliced. As though something impossibly sharp had passed through it. Ethan stepped outside. The wind was wrong. Too still. And then he saw it. At the far end of the street. A boy. Young, dressed in a hoodie 2 sizes too big. Standing motionless in the middle of the road. Staring straight at him. Ethan's breath caught. He knew that look. The wide eyes. The trembling jaw. It was familiar. He walked down the front steps. Slowly. The boy didn't move. Didn't blink. Ethan stopped at the edge of the driveway. "Hey," he called gently. The boy raised one hand. Not to wave. To show him something. Clutched in the boy's palm was a string. And on the end of that string, a bell. Not cracked. Not aged. New. Shining. Untouched. Ethan's stomach turned. "No," he whispered. The boy tilted his head, then began to walk forward. The bell didn't ring. Not yet. But Ethan knew. This wasn't someone caught in the scream. This wasn't a soul devoured by the silence. This boy had volunteered. Because Ethan hadn't taken the burden. Someone else had. And the bell had chosen anyway. Not out of need. Not out of desperation. Out of inevitability. The scream didn't stop when Ethan broke the bell. It just found another note to play. The boy stopped 5 feet away, looked up, and smiled. "Thank you," he said. Ethan stepped back. For what? For setting it free. He held up the bell. And this time, it rang. Not loud, not angry, but clear. And Ethan understood. He hadn't destroyed the rhythm. He'd changed it. The scream wouldn't come from shadows anymore. Wouldn't hide in corridors or forests or dreams. Now it would wear the faces of children, of neighbors, of anyone who whispered yes. The scream had evolved, and he had been the catalyst. The boy turned, walked back into the street. Each footstep left a faint imprint in the air, as though time warped slightly around him. And from the houses on either side, other doors creaked open, one by one. Children stepped out, some holding bells, others simply staring, silent, smiling, waiting. Ethan stepped back into the house, locked the door. But he knew locks wouldn't help anymore. The scream didn't need to hunt him. It would invite him. And next time, it wouldn't ask for permission. The bell had learned. And the silence. The silence was now the bait. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Not because he was afraid of nightmares. No. He'd learned long ago that dreams were the least of his problems. He stayed awake because of the quiet. That perfect, unnatural quiet that blanketed the neighborhood like fog after a fire. The children had vanished after the bell rang. One by one, they'd drifted back into their homes, leaving the street looking normal again. But Ethan knew better. It was never normal. Not anymore. He sat in the living room, arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching the window. The coffee table still had his mother's mug on it. Half full. Lukewarm now. A scene frozen from some forgotten peace. But the stillness in the air didn't feel peaceful. It felt expectant, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to move first. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the familiarity. This felt like the moments before the bus crash. before the corridor, before the cave. That fragile space between ignorance and awakening, when something terrible was about to start, but hadn't quite announced itself yet. But now, Ethan wasn't a passenger. He wasn't a pawn, he was a witness. And witnessing was a curse of its own. Just after midnight, he heard it again. A faint chime, one single ring, far off. Not from his street, not even from this town. It was deeper than sound. It was a signal. The bell had been picked up elsewhere. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the moon hung low and sickly yellow. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, bending around trees and rooftops in ways they shouldn't. The neighborhood looked untouched, but he could feel it twisting underneath, like the very ground had accepted the scream's new form. Suddenly, his phone vibrated on the counter. He hadn't touched it since he'd arrived. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. A single notification lit the screen. Unknown number. Did you hear it? No name. No reply option. Just the message. A moment later, another. They're waking up. He stared at the screen, heart racing. The message dissolved before he could take a screenshot. Then the phone powered off. Not shut down. Died. As if its battery had been drained in an instant. A soft tapping came from the window. Not knocking. Tapping. Rhythmic. He turned slowly, afraid to look but unable to resist. A face peered in. A child, maybe 6 years old, expression blank, eyes wide. Pupils dilated like pinpricks of ink on glass. The child lifted his hand. A tiny bell dangled from his fingers. He rang it once. Ethan stumbled backward, knocking over the coffee table. But the sound didn't come through the glass. Not directly. It came inside his head. A memory, but not his own. He saw something, briefly. A farmhouse. Fields burning. A woman holding her hands over her ears, screaming until blood poured from her nose. Children standing in a circle around her, each holding a bell. And then, darkness. Ethan gasped. The child outside was gone. Just gone. No footsteps. No door creaking. No wind. Ethan sank to the floor dizzy. He pressed his palms to his temples and tried to breathe. But the ringing didn't leave. It had latched onto him. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a signal. A way of marking those who had seen too much. And Ethan had seen everything. He tried to think logically. What had changed? He had stopped his younger self from accepting the bell. He had shattered the old rhythm. But now the bell wasn't singular. It was everywhere. In fragments. In pockets of silence. It didn't need a corridor or a veil or a monstrous echoing form to spread. It had spread through people. Through memory. He stood up, heart pounding, and paced the room. If it was no longer just about breaking the bell, if it had seated itself across others, then there had to be a pattern. A chain. Something holding it together. And then he remembered the drawing. In the chapel, before it collapsed. The woman had stood before a wall of symbols. Carved into the stone were circles, not just one. Dozens, each connected to a line. A web. A network. The bell hadn't been a single curse. It had been a system. A chain of echoes passed down through time, waiting for a world fractured enough to let them all ring at once. That's what the scream had been building toward. Not just a cycle of terror. A chorus. Ethan clenched his fists. No more running. No more hiding in silence. He grabbed the keys from the kitchen counter, slipped on a jacket, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a slap. Not the weather. The air. It recoiled from him, like the world already knew he was awake. And it was afraid. He walked down the street, past the silent houses. Every window was dark, every door shut, but behind each one he felt them. Eyes, watching, waiting, children who had said yes. Parents who never questioned why their child had started whispering to corners of the room. Entire families slowly tuning themselves to the scream. He had one chance. Find the center of the web, find the first new bell, and silence it before it rang again. His phone buzzed again, against all logic. A new message. You shouldn't have warned him. Ethan's chest went cold. Another. You were supposed to hold it. Now they will. And then one final message. It's already started in Granger. Granger, he knew that name. A small town. 20 miles away. Sleepy, forgotten. Perfect for something to fester. He picked up his pace. The scream had evolved, yes. But so had he. And if this was a new beginning, then he would be the end. Granger looked like any other small town tucked away in the folds of a forgotten map. Dusty roads, faded storefronts, power lines humming with lazy energy, and sidewalks cracked from years of disuse. But as Ethan drove past the crooked welcome sign, he knew something was wrong. The air here didn't feel still, it felt held. Like the entire town was gripping something behind its back, trying to act normal while hiding a secret that wanted to scream. Every window was closed, every curtain drawn, and not a single soul wandered the streets. It wasn't late. The sun still hung overhead, bloated and too orange for the time of day. But Granger had shut down. Not for the night, but for something far more ancient. He parked near the diner on Main Street. It was an old building with peeling mint, green paint, and a crooked sign that read "O Pen," but the lights inside were off. He stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, the only sound in a place that should have been alive. Not even the birds dared speak here. He walked toward the door and tried the handle. It gave way too easily. The bell above the door rang once. Not a real bell. The bell. That same low, humming chime that didn't pass through the air. It passed through you. It vibrated against bone. Against memory. Ethan paused, his hand still on the door, as the sound faded like a whisper being swallowed. The diner was empty. Half-finished meals sat on tables. Coffee had gone cold in cracked mugs. One booth near the window still had a baby seat on it, a bib thrown across the edge as if its owner had been pulled away mid-lunch. But there were no signs of struggle, no chaos, just absence, like the people had vanished without thinking. Ethan walked slowly through the space, his eyes catching every detail. A napkin on the counter had something scribbled on it in red ink. "Do notios dar teach doar." He stared at it, the words sinking into his skin like a warning too late to matter. He made his way behind the counter and opened the door to the kitchen. That's when he heard it again. A bell. This one soft, delicate. It rang 3 times. Each chime closer than the last. He stopped breathing. Then, a child's voice, behind him. No one ever listens to the first ring. He turned, but no one was there. Just the diner, still, watching. He backed into the kitchen, and immediately the smell hit him, coppery and sharp. Blood, but not fresh, old. Like it had soaked into the tiles and stayed there, refusing to fade. The kitchen was clean, but something in the air carried the memory of something awful. He followed the scent to the freezer door. It was slightly ajar, a smear of something dark leading inside. He hesitated, opened it. The light flickered once. Inside was a small, frost-covered body, a boy, no older than 10. Eyes closed, mouth sewn shut, a bell tied around his wrist, and carved into his forehead the word "co-d-u-s-t-o-r." Ethan stepped back, bile rising in his throat. The scream hadn't just spread, it had organized. It was assigning roles now. Conductor, not a bell holder, not a whisperer, a leader. Something was orchestrating this. He closed the freezer gently, hands shaking. This wasn't about stopping children from ringing bells anymore. This was about finding the ones who taught them how. He stumbled out of the diner. The sun suddenly gone. Clouds had crawled across the sky without sound or warning, turning everything a muted gray. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. Then he heard laughter, childlike. Echoing, but not playful. It came from the school across the street. Of course, if something was spreading the scream, if it was teaching, the school would be the hive. He crossed the street, each step heavier than the last. The closer he got, the louder the laughter became. And with it, chimes. Lots of them. All ringing at once. Not in chaos, but in rhythm, like a choir tuning before a concert. The front doors of the school were wide open. Inviting, he entered. The hallway was covered in drawings, crayon on paper, But they weren't happy sketches, they were rituals. Circles, faces, trees with mouths, eyes in walls and bells, so many bells. Some had words under them, names scratched in messy handwriting. Mr. Powell, Mrs. Rena, Officer Tully. Each name was crossed out, erased, replaced by a symbol, a bell in a cage. He followed the hallway toward the main classroom. The sound of bells growing louder, more coordinated. He reached the door. It was shut. A child's voice drifted from inside. Everyone stand for the pledge. Another voice, softer, one ring, under scream, indivisible, with silence and memory for all. The class erupted in applause. Ethan gripped the knob and turned it. The classroom was full. 20 children stood facing a chalkboard. On the board, a single phrase written over and over in thick chalk: The world lies tends to awacho Ryan's first. And at the front of the class, facing the students, was the teacher. Except it wasn't a teacher. It was her, the veiled woman. Whole, tall, smiling. But her veil was gone. And her face, Ethan staggered back. It was his face, his eyes, but hollowed out, dried. Puppeted by something deeper. She turned and met his gaze. "Welcome back," she said, voice sweet and poisonous. "Class, this is the one who broke the bell." The children turned in unison. 20 faces, each with a bell stitched into the skin of their throats. Their mouths opened, and the scream began again. Ethan didn't run. Not because he was brave, not because he had a plan, but because running wouldn't help anymore. The moment the children opened their mouths and that low, unified scream began to rise, quiet at first, then spiraling like a storm brewing inside a violin string. He knew he was already inside the sound. You didn't run from something once it had your name. You endured it. Or you lost yourself trying to. The classroom darkened not by shadows but by vibration. The windows trembled. The floor rippled, not shaking, but resonating. Every desk, every chair, every bell stitched into those children's throats vibrated in harmony, turning the room into a living speaker for the echo that had no origin anymore. And she, the one wearing his face, stood still at the head of it all, calm, grinning. The chalkboard behind her now cracked with spiderwebs of sound. The words "World lestens Teobolo Ryan's first" he bled down like dripping ink, reforming into something new. Bell has Kosinen. Ethan dropped to one knee, his ears bleeding, vision swimming, breath shallow. He tried to move but couldn't. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was pull. The scream wasn't loud in a traditional way. It was deep. It reached into the gut, the spine, the marrow. It was a call to join, to surrender, to ring. And the terrifying part, for a brief second, he wanted to. He wanted to let go, to stop running, to stop holding. The idea of laying the weight down, of letting the scream take over, felt like relief. And that's when he realized exactly why the scream had never needed to chase anyone. It simply waited for them to get tired. That was the curse. You didn't have to be cursed to hear the bell. You just had to be exhausted enough to want it. The woman with his face walked forward. Each step made no sound. The children didn't move, just held the note, their mouths open. Throats rattling with a tone that shouldn't come from anything human. She knelt beside Ethan, her long fingers brushing against his cheek like a mother tending to a fevered child. "I was born the moment you refused to carry it," she whispered. "You broke the bell, but you left the sound behind. And sound always needs a body." He gritted his teeth. Blood ran from his nose. "I didn't choose you," he rasped. She smiled wider. "No, but you created me. Every scream you silenced, every memory you buried, every deal you refused to make, it all collected. I am the shadow of your no, the echo of your defiance. And now I am what the bell needed all along." She stood again and turned to the children. Class dismissed. They stopped screaming instantly. Dead silence. And then they blinked in perfect unison. Their eyes rolled upward, and they all dropped to the floor limp. But they weren't dead. They were empty. Vessels. The bells in their throats glowed faintly red, still active, still waiting. Ethan finally stood, stumbling against a desk for support. "What are you trying to do?" he asked. "Why the schools? Why the children?" Her smile was like a mask stretching over something darker. "Because they listen." She gestured toward the board. "They don't question. They absorb. The younger the vessel, the clearer the tone. I don't need fear anymore, Ethan. I need believers." And now the first classroom has graduated. She walked to the chalkboard and traced her finger along a deep gouge in the wood. Every one of them will go home and carry the scream in their bones. They'll touch their parents, and the sound will pass like static. The bell doesn't need to be rung anymore. It just needs to be remembered. Ethan's pulse hammered. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't a curse. This was infection. He looked down at the closest child. Their lips moved, soundlessly. Mouthing something on repeat, he leaned closer. 5 words. "I hear you. I obey." He backed away. This wasn't just a town in danger anymore. This was the beginning of something global. The bells weren't trapped in objects. They were coded into minds, into the obedient, into the next generation. The scream had rewritten its rules, and the worst part, it was smarter now. Smarter than him. He ran. This time with purpose. He didn't know where yet. But he had to get out of the school. He had to think. As he reached the front doors, the hallway darkened behind him. No children stirred. No echoes followed. But he felt her smile behind his back like heat from an open flame. "You'll come back," her voice called after him. "Because you still want to know the final note." He pushed through the doors and stumbled into daylight. But the sun had dimmed. Not from clouds, from distance. It felt farther away, like light was struggling to reach this part of the world. He climbed into his car and drove. Fast, hands shaking, mind racing, because he had seen what was coming. Not another scream, not another shadow, but a choir. A symphony of trained minds and loyal mouths. And if he didn't stop it before the first concert, it would never stop ringing. Ever. Ethan drove without blinking, without speaking, without even realizing he'd left his headlights on in broad daylight. The landscape around him warped like a dream stitched together with bad thread. Familiar yet off, each tree on the roadside leaning too far in, the shadows beneath them a little too thick, too eager. The road stretched ahead, cracked and faded, barely visible under the tire tracks of something much heavier than a car. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to move. He had to put distance between himself and Granger, between himself and the classroom full of children, whose eyes didn't blink, whose throats carried a new kind of hymn. The scream had changed its method, and he had seen its new face. It wore his. That wasn't just manipulation. It was personal, a message. A declaration that the sound wasn't just evolving, it was replacing. He had tried to stop it by breaking the bell, by going back and severing his own origin. But in doing so he'd created a vacuum. The sound had filled it, clever, patient, unstoppable. And now it had infiltrated schools, children, institutions that weren't just vulnerable. They were designed to absorb information without resistance. Ethan reached a long, curved bend in the road where a rusted sign leaned into the ditch. He slowed the car and read it through the grime, streaked windshield. Shady Pines, Institute of Memory Care. It shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. He didn't remember ever being here. But his stomach turned anyway. The name scratched at something deep inside his thoughts. A half, buried flash white halls, flickering lights, and a man whispering to the ceiling about bells that used to speak backwards. It had been just before Ethan was released from the hospital after the accident. A brief mention. A footnote in a therapist's journal. The man had been dismissed as a lost case, too far gone to help, but maybe not too far gone to remember. If the scream had chosen the young, maybe the answers lay with the old. Those whose minds were too afraid to spread the sound. But perhaps sharp enough to remember its earliest notes. He pulled into the empty parking lot. The building loomed ahead, beige and tired, windows tinted, the air unnaturally still. No birds. No wind. The flagpole out front had no flag, but the chain still tapped gently against the metal like someone whispering through a keyhole. Inside, the lobby was deserted. No receptionist, no chatter, just a low hum, constant, just under hearing range. Ethan followed it through long hallways lined with linoleum floors and muted wallpaper. The smell of bleach and sadness hung in the air. Each room he passed had the same eerie stillness, beds made, curtains drawn, chairs slightly turned like their owners had just stood up and forgotten to come back. Then he found room 209. The door was cracked. From inside came the unmistakable rhythm of tapping, but not random. Measured, intentional. He stepped in slowly. An old man sat by the window, a blanket over his legs, one hand tapping a spoon against the metal bed frame in a precise rhythm. Tap, 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 pause, tap. Ethan didn't speak at first. He just listened. And then the man spoke, without turning around. You broke it, didn't you? But didn't know it had roots. Ethan stiffened. How do you know that? The man chuckled. Because I tried too, long before you. Thought I could crack it, bury it, outrun it. But the bell ain't just metal, son. It's memory. The more you try to forget it, the louder it gets. Ethan stepped closer. Who are you? The man finally turned his head. His eyes were cataract clouded, but they focused on Ethan with unnatural precision. I was a conductor. Before they called it that. Back when it was just whispers in the drain pipes and lullabies that made the dogs howl. Ethan's mouth went dry. You're the one who started it. The man laughed. No, boy. I was the first one who heard it right. But I didn't make it. The scream's older than music. Older than words. It's the sound the world makes when it remembers something it was supposed to forget. Ethan took a shaky breath. How do I stop it? The man went quiet, then said you don't. You contain it, like fire, like grief. You find the note that closes the loop. And then you teach it to someone who will listen without being devoured. Ethan shook his head. The kids, they're already singing it. Schools are teaching it. The scream's not hidden anymore. It's institutionalized. The man grinned, showing crooked teeth. Exactly. Which means it's louder now. And the louder it gets, the easier it'll be to find the end of it. Ethan blinked. The end. The man reached into his blanket and pulled out a tiny, hand-carved bell. It didn't ring. It pulsed. Slow, like a heartbeat. This one, the man said, was carved from the first silence. Took me 40 years to find it. Buried beneath a church that doesn't show up on any maps. Every bell needs a counter bell. A tone that cancels it. You don't break the scream by screaming back. You break it by listening deeper. Ethan reached for it, but the man pulled it away. Not yet, he said. You touch it now, it'll burn the rest of your memories out. You ain't ready. Then what do I do? Go to the chapel at the edge of the pines. It's not marked. Just a red door with no knob. Stand outside it at midnight and wait. If you still remember why you came when the door opens, you'll hear the tone. Not before. Ethan swallowed. And if I forget? The man's smile faded. Then you join the choir. Outside the hum deepened. Ethan looked toward the window and saw movement in the tree line. Small figures. Children. Dozens of them. Watching. He turned back to the man, but the room was empty now. No spoon. No tapping. No warmth in the bed. Just a small engraving in the wall, carved with shaking hands. To forget is to sing. To remember is to stand alone. Ethan turned and ran. The forest was breathing. Not with wind, not with rustling leaves or creaking trees, but with something slower, deeper, like the land itself had lungs. As Ethan made his way through the pines toward the place the old man had described, every step felt like it echoed through a dream half remembered. The ground wasn't soft, but it yielded, as if the earth knew he was coming, and wasn't entirely sure if it wanted him to arrive. The deeper he went, the thicker the silence became. It wasn't the kind of quiet that offered peace. It was the kind that noticed you. And in that noticing, you felt the weight of every decision, every moment you didn't scream, every time you let someone else carry the sound. He checked his phone, but the screen had gone black an hour ago. Not broken, just unwilling. Technology didn't work here. Not where the scream had first curled itself around the roots of memory. It wasn't midnight yet, but close. The trees had pressed in tighter, the sliver of moonlight above barely reaching the forest floor. Then he saw it, a clearing up ahead. At the center, standing like a wound carved from time, was the chapel. It wasn't what he expected. No steeple, no cross. Just a tall, square building of dark stone and moss-covered walls. And in the center of its front face, a red door. No handle, no window. Just paint so vibrant, it looked like it had been freshly brushed on with blood. Ethan stepped into the clearing, the hairs on his arms rising. No birds, no insects, no breeze. Just presence, as if the building had been waiting for him and only him. He approached the door slowly, heart pounding. He half expected something to jump out, to pull him inside, to mock him for even trying. But nothing moved. He stood before it, barely a foot away, and whispered, "I remember." The trees seemed to lean in closer. He glanced around. No sound, no ticking clock. Only his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. He waited. A minute passed, then 5. The silence didn't change. But his thoughts did. He began to forget. Not names, not faces, but reasons. Why he was here. What he needed. Why the bell mattered. It was like mist creeping in. Not from the trees, but from inside his own skull. "You're tired, Ethan. You've done enough. Let someone else carry it now. This isn't your burden anymore. Just rest." His knees buckled slightly. He closed his eyes. The voice in his head wasn't cruel. It was comforting. That's how the scream worked now. It didn't terrify. It invited. And people welcomed it with open arms. He felt sleep trying to take him. But then, from the depths of the memory he thought he'd buried for good, he heard something. A laugh, not cruel, innocent, his brother's, the way he used to laugh before the fire, before the bell, before the deal. Ethan's eyes snapped open. "I remember," he growled. The red door breathed, not swung open, not creaked, it inhaled. And then it vanished. No explosion, no shimmer. It simply ceased to be, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. He didn't hesitate. He stepped in. The stairs went down for what felt like miles. Each step heavier than the last, not physically, but mentally. With every level, a new memory came rushing back. The first time he saw the bell. The first time he heard someone scream and realized no one else could hear it. The moment he chose to stop listening. Each memory cut him as it returned, slicing away pieces of comfort he hadn't even realized he'd built around himself. By the time he reached the bottom, he was shaking. But awake, fully awake. The chamber was circular. Black stone walls, no ceiling, just endless height above him. And in the center, suspended in air, was a tuning fork made of bone and gold, floating, humming, alive. He stepped closer. Etched into the floor around it were words in a language he didn't recognize, but understood anyway. Only one may hold the last note. Only one may forget the cost. He reached out. His hand passed through air and met resistance. The fork didn't move, but it responded. A low vibration pulsed through his arm, into his chest, into his soul. Then the fork spoke, not in words, in feeling. It showed him the shape of the scream, what it had once been. Not a curse, not a weapon, but a warning, a tone designed to echo through generations, keeping a memory alive. A memory of something that should never be allowed to return. But the memory had been warped, perverted, turned into worship. The scream had become the god instead of the message. And now it was everywhere. In children, in systems, in songs no one realized they were humming. The only way to stop it was to ring this. The last tone, the one that remembered the scream's true purpose. But once rung, it would erase him, not kill him, not destroy him, but remove him from the memory of the world. He would vanish from photos, from stories, from the eyes of everyone he'd ever touched. Even his own name would become a hollow sound. Ethan stared at the fork. Could he do that? Could he disappear completely? Was the silence of his name worth the peace of the world? He thought of the children in Granger, of the face that wore his own, of the final message the old man had left: to forget is to sing. To remember is to stand alone. He closed his eyes and reached out. His fingers closed around the tuning fork. It rang once, and the world above shifted. Somewhere, a teacher stopped mid-sentence and forgot what she was saying. Her hand paused above the whiteboard as her students stared, unsure whether the silence was part of the lesson or something much deeper. In a basement in Missouri, a child dropped a crayon drawing of a bell stitched into a tree trunk, confused by the image that moments ago had filled her with pride. On a highway bridge outside Granger, a group of teenagers stood in silence, unsure why they had gathered there with lit candles, unsure who they were mourning. And in a hospital bed where time had all but stopped, an old man whispered a name, then blinked, confused, wondering why his mouth had moved at all. The world paused for just a moment, not from fear, not from loss, but from absence. Something had left, or rather someone. Ethan didn't feel the ringing of the tuning fork. He didn't hear it through his ears. It wasn't sound, it was subtraction. When he gripped that final tone, what moved through him wasn't noise, but clarity. Every memory he had fought to bury was pulled from his spine. Every decision etched into his past unraveled like threads being plucked from a tapestry. But it wasn't cruel. It wasn't violent. It was deliberate. The scream had twisted itself into the world by making people remember the wrong things. But this was the opposite. This was setting things right, not by forcing silence, but by erasing the glitch that had made the noise grow in the first place. He opened his eyes, but he wasn't in the chamber anymore. He stood in the middle of a small suburban street. The air was warm, quiet. A soft breeze rustled the leaves. A mailbox across the road read H. Moore in faded letters. A boy rode his bike past him, laughing. A mother called out from a porch. Everything looked normal, but Ethan knew, in the way that deep bones remember storms, that this was not the same world. This was the corrected one. He wandered down the street. No one looked at him. No one greeted him. Not in rudeness, but in pure, innocent ignorance. They didn't know him, didn't see him. He walked past the park. Children played on swings. No bells, no humming, no strange drawings on the concrete. He passed a church. The doors were open. Inside, people were gathered, not in cult-like silence, but in laughter, in song, in truth. No veiled woman in the pews. No whispers behind the altar. He entered and stood at the back. A man next to him turned and smiled politely, then turned back without a second glance. Ethan was invisible now. Not to the eye, but to history. He didn't exist. The scream had no root in him anymore. The chain had been broken, and with it, the scream itself had quieted. But there were fragments. Ethan could feel them. Not in the buildings, not in the ground, but in the air. Faint echoes. Shivers of something that had once roared and now could only whisper. He stepped outside. The sun was starting to set, painting the clouds with oranges and purples that looked almost unreal. That's when he saw her. A little girl across the street, staring at him. She shouldn't have been able to. But she was. She tilted her head, then smiled. She crossed the road slowly, like a dream wading through syrup. When she stood in front of him, her eyes weren't wide with fear. They were calm. "You're the reason I don't hear it anymore," she said. Ethan knelt, startled. "You can see me," she nodded. "Not with these," she tapped her temple, "but with this." Her hand went to her chest. "What's your name?" he asked. She paused, then shook her head. "I don't know. But that's okay. I used to hear it every night, the ringing. It made my teeth hurt. My dog barked at the walls. My mom cried in her sleep, but it stopped yesterday." "Yesterday?" Ethan echoed. She nodded again. "When it rang the other way." Ethan stared at her. The bell hadn't just been silenced, it had been reversed. He looked up. The trees swayed again, but this time, not as if breathing, but exhaling, letting go. Across the town, things had returned to the way they were supposed to be, but the girl was proof that some fragments remained. Memories in people who weren't born yet when the scream first spread. People not affected directly, but carriers of its weight. "You remember, don't you?" he asked. She thought for a moment, then said, "Only the shape. Not the sound." "That's good," Ethan said. Then stood, she smiled. "Are you going now?" "I think I already have." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. A bell. Wooden, cracked, silent. "I found this in the yard," she said, "but it doesn't do anything." He looked at it. It was one of the originals, but hollow now. Empty. He smiled and shook his head. "That's yours. Keep it." She looked down at it and nodded. Then ran back across the street, back to the world she no longer had to be afraid of. Ethan turned and walked into the setting sun, not because he had somewhere to go, but because he didn't. Because the scream no longer needed to be fought. Because the scream no longer remembered him. And for the first time since he was a boy, the silence wasn't haunting, it was earned. The sound was over, the story told. But far in the distance, buried deep in a forest where no one lived and no maps showed, something moved. It wasn't a bell. It wasn't a scream. It was the idea of a sound. And ideas never truly die. Ideas don't sleep, they wait. And in the stillness after the scream had faded, after Ethan had rung the last tone and the world had quietly forgotten his name, something far more patient began to stir. Not in the forests, not in the shadows of chapels or the cracks between bedtime prayers, but in the blank spaces. The moments of silence where meaning had once lived. And in one such silence, deep beneath the oldest part of the earth, where neither light nor memory dares to reach, a flicker blinked into existence. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a voice. It was a question, sharp and formless. What if the silence itself becomes hungry? Ethan, if he still was Ethan, had no way of knowing any of this. Not directly. Not in the way that people know things through facts or names. But somewhere inside the nothingness he'd become, there was a ripple. A shift. Like the tug of a thread in a sweater no one remembered knitting. He had become absence itself, freed from the scream's grasp, erased from the collective song of the world, and yet aware. Aware that something unfinished had been left behind. Aware that while the scream had been silenced, the stage it stood on still remained, and something else had stepped onto it. Back in Granger, the little girl who once handed Ethan a broken bell began to notice that music sounded strange. Her lullabies felt slower, like the rhythm no longer fit her heartbeat. When her mother spoke, there was sometimes a pause, brief, imperceptible to most, between words where the air felt heavy, empty. Those moments began to grow. Her dog, once barky and wild, now refused to make a sound. He stared at the walls as if he heard something after the silence. Not before, not instead of, but following it. The idea that had begun in the depths had found a new shape, not a scream to force memory, not a bell to herald fear, but a pause, a vacuum. A new horror had begun, one that didn't scream at all. It simply waited for people to notice it. And when they did, they couldn't unhear it. Somewhere in a radio station outside Cleveland, a DJ played an old vinyl, only to realize midway through that an entire verse had disappeared. Not skipped, not scratched, erased. The static in the gap held something unnatural, something that listened back. That night, he drove into a lake without braking. In a classroom in Oregon, a boy named Liam opened his mouth to read aloud, but no words came out. His teacher encouraged him to try again. He did. Still nothing. The silence clung to him like wet cloth. He blinked, confused, and tried humming instead. But the hum came after the note. It lagged, disconnected, and when he finally whispered a single syllable, the power in the building flickered. These weren't curses. They weren't accidents. They were tendrils of a new thing. Where Ethan had broken the bell's control over memory, he had accidentally made silence more powerful than it had ever been before. What had once been a weapon of terror now became a canvas. And the silence, starved for purpose, had begun to shape itself in ways no one could predict. Somewhere outside the folds of time and understanding, Ethan, or what little was left of him, felt it. The fork he'd once held now pulsed faintly through the void. Not calling him back, that was impossible. He was beyond return, but the echo of him remained. His action had erased his identity, but imprinted his decision into the space between realities. That decision, sacrifice over control, was now being tested. Could the world survive when silence itself became an entity? Could it remain sane when moments of nothing began asking questions? And then, in the back of a diner in New Mexico, a man named Darius began to write on a napkin. He didn't know why. Didn't know how the pen got in his hand. Didn't even remember walking in. But the napkin read, "The scream is gone." Now comes the pause. He blinked, looked around. He was the only one in the diner. The waitress stood frozen mid-pour. Coffee hovered just above the cup. No motion, no sound. Time hadn't stopped. But something else had taken its place. And in that moment, Darius heard something not through his ears, but through the absence of everything else. A voice made of no voice. It asked what happens when silence learns to speak. He dropped the pen. The lights came back on. The waitress moved as if nothing happened. But Darius knew something had changed. Not just in him. Everywhere. The scream was loud and terrifying. But this new thing, the pause, was patient. It wouldn't consume with force. It would wait until someone needed it. Until they leaned into the quiet and listened a little too closely. It had no name yet, but it was forming one. And the people who remembered the scream, those who almost forgot, they would be the first to carry it. Because silence, like any idea, only needed one believer. The pause spread not like a storm but like a scent, subtle, untraceable, yet impossible to forget once noticed. People didn't scream when it reached them. They didn't run or hide or warn anyone. They just stopped, mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-motion. Something inside them would hesitate, just for a breath, and that moment would stretch too long to be natural. Too quiet to be safe. And when the pause passed, they'd continue like nothing had happened. Except for the haunted glaze in their eyes, and the way they looked at clocks, like time had suddenly started lying. No one remembered Ethan, not truly, but his absence, the space he left behind, had become a kind of signal. A map drawn in negative. People who were close to the edges of knowing, who lived at the border between coincidence and realization, had started to feel it. The wrongness, the emptiness, the subtle way conversations fell apart the second someone mentioned bells or screaming or silence that didn't feel silent at all. Darius, the man from the diner, couldn't sleep. He kept returning to the napkin. The words he had written down, "The scream is gone." Now comes the pause. Felt like someone else had written them. They came with no context, no emotion, just truth. He tried burning the napkin. It didn't catch fire. He ran it under water. The ink didn't run. And when he threw it out, it reappeared in his back pocket the next morning. Always dry, always crisp, always waiting. And then one night, the power went out in his apartment. He stood in the hallway with a flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. His phone lit up, but only showed a black screen with a single blinking cursor. No icons, no signal, just that silent pulse. In the distance, through the paper, thin walls, he heard his neighbor's television flicker. Then cut to static. But the static didn't sound right. It pulsed in rhythms, breathing patterns, like Morse code for a god no one worshipped yet. Darius pressed his ear to the wall. What he heard wasn't words. It was nothing, so pure and so present it became deafening. His body seized. His mouth opened, not to scream, but to breathe it in. The pause didn't want noise. It wanted space. It filled him like smoke in a vacuum, settling into his spine. He collapsed in his kitchen and saw, just before losing consciousness, the outline of a figure standing at the edge of the hallway. No face, no clothes. Just a silhouette with one finger pressed where its mouth would be. Sure. And then it was gone. Darius awoke the next morning with a new napkin in his hand. This one said, "Don't speak. Don't think. Just carry." He wasn't alone. In a library in Oregon, a woman named June flipped through an encyclopedia and found an entry that shouldn't have existed. The pause see also memory loss, collective silence, pre-linguistic resonance. But when she turned the page back, the entry was gone. Not removed, erased. The paper was smooth, the way pages are before they've ever been printed. She blinked and realized she couldn't remember what day it was. In Tokyo, a subway conductor halted his train between stops after noticing all the passengers were frozen mid-blink. For exactly 12 seconds. Then, all at once, they resumed breathing. Not a single one remembered it. In South Africa, a choir practicing for an international competition lost their voices for 8 hours straight. No one had spoken a word when it returned. The pause was creeping, not through language, but through the gaps in language. It was becoming the air between words, the space between beats. And it was learning. People began to describe dreams they couldn't recall. Moments they knew something profound had happened, but only remembered the lead up and the aftermath. Never the moment itself. One man jumped from a rooftop claiming he had seen the real map of the world in the seconds after his wife stopped speaking mid-dinner. He survived. But when asked who he was trying to escape, he wept and said, "No one. That's what makes it worse." And in the background, all across the globe, bell towers began to crumble. Not explode, not decay, collapse. Some said it was coincidence. Others said nothing at all. But there were a few who felt it. A thread pulling tighter. They didn't know Ethan's name, but they felt the hole he left behind. And in that hole, the pause was building a new story. One without heroes. One without sounds. One that begins after the final note fades. In a hospital long since abandoned, a nurse who had never worked there stood in front of a rusted bed frame. She didn't know why, only that something had told her to bring a stethoscope. She placed it against the mattress. No heartbeat, but a rhythm. Not fast, not slow, just patient. Waiting for someone to notice. Waiting for someone to answer it. She stood, turned around, and walked out the door. She didn't tell anyone, but she began speaking less, pausing more. And at night, she stared into mirrors just long enough to wonder whose breath was fogging the glass. The scream had demanded to be heard. The pause didn't demand anything. It simply was, and that made it far harder to stop. Because how do you fight something that becomes stronger the longer you do nothing? Somewhere in the corner of the world, beneath the weight of a ceiling fan that had stopped spinning without anyone noticing, a woman named Mara spoke when she wasn't supposed to. That was her first mistake. Not because there were rules anymore, not because anyone told her not to, but because in a world slowly surrendering to the pause, speaking at the wrong time was like stepping into a vacuum barefoot. And when Mara opened her mouth and said the words, "This isn't silence, it's hiding," something blinked. Not a person, not a creature, but a space. A fold in the air behind her refrigerator, just slightly too deep, too still. She hadn't meant to break the spell. She hadn't even realized she was resisting. But some part of her, buried under the slow encroachment of that new quiet, had noticed the wrongness. Not in noise, but in rhythm. And when she spoke those words, her kitchen did not respond with shattering lights or poltergeist shrieks. Instead, it did something far more terrifying. It listened, and then it rewound. Mara blinked. She was holding a spoon again, standing at the stove. The same pot of soup she'd already stirred 5 minutes ago. But the spoon was dry, the pot cold. Her phone, which she'd left charging, now blinked 7:03 p.m. The exact minute before she'd spoken. It had reset her. Not killed her. Not scared her. Just rewound her to before she questioned it. But Mara was sharp. And her memory, at least for now, still worked. She dropped the spoon. This time she didn't speak. She grabbed her coat and left the apartment. Outside, the air felt off. Not chilled. Not humid. Just filtered. Like the sky was trying to muffle itself, as if even clouds feared creating thunder that might interrupt the stillness. People walked with distant smiles. No headphones. No music. No idle chatter. No sidewalk musicians. Not even the mechanical whine of cars. Only the shushing rhythm of tires over damp roads and the low hum of engines designed not to draw attention. Mara walked 2 blocks before she noticed it. A man was following her. He didn't speak. Didn't look threatening. Just kept the same distance. Never too close. Never too far. When she turned a corner and broke line of sight for half a second, she ducked into an alley and waited. He never passed. She stepped back out and looked around. The man was standing where she had been 2 minutes ago, waiting. Not scanning, not hunting. Waiting. That's when she understood. He wasn't tracking her movements. He was tracking her thoughts. Following the idea of resistance. Following the ripple she had created by speaking where silence had taken root. The pause didn't need soldiers. It needed echoes. And anyone who tried to be louder than it was tagged by something that didn't use eyes or ears, but absence. Mara fled the city. Took a train. Rented a car. Cut her credit cards. Anything to stop herself from becoming traceable by patterns. It worked, at first. The further she drove, the louder the world became. In the outskirts of nowhere, crickets still sang, wind still bent the trees into hissing dances, and her radio crackled with gospel songs sung by voices too old to care about the new hush. She found a motel near the desert, one of those rundown places with rotary phones and buzzed-out neon signs. The man at the front desk gave her a room key without asking for a name. "You're not the first," he said. She froze. "What do you mean?" He stared at her a little too long. Then said, "I mean, there's been others. Always show up looking like they ran from a dream they weren't supposed to wake up from." "Do they talk about it?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. That's how I know they're the right ones. They don't talk. Just listen and wait." "For what?" He handed her the key. Then said, "For someone like you to say something first." That night, Mara sat in her motel room, staring at the ceiling fan that had no blades. Just an empty base where they'd once spun, and she started writing. Not with a laptop, not her phone, but with pen and paper. Something the pause hadn't yet infected. She didn't write a journal or a plea for help. She wrote sound. Described it. The pitch of her mother's voice when she was angry. The crash of a wave that nearly drowned her at 16. The exact intonation of the word, "no," the last time she heard her grandfather say it. She wrote until her hand cramped. Then she wrote more, because she could feel something testing her, reaching through the cracks in the floorboards, pressing against the doorknob, not to enter, but to measure her willingness to resist. It didn't fear her, not yet, but it was interested. And that meant she had already done more than Ethan had, because Ethan had erased himself to win. Mara intended to stay visible, even if it killed her, especially if it did. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the rotary phone rang. Just once, she picked it up. There was no voice, but there was breathing, and beneath it, far beneath, the faintest tick of a metronome. Not speeding up, not slowing down, just tracking. "Why are you hiding?" Mara asked. The breathing stopped. A beat. Then, "We are not hiding. We are waiting for you to stop making noise." She gripped the receiver until her knuckles went white. "Then you'll wait a long damn time." The line went dead. Outside, the motel sign flickered off for the first time in years. Inside, Mara smiled. She had been heard. And that meant the pause had boundaries. It could be agitated, pushed, maybe even broken, but only by those who were willing to stay in the story. Ethan had saved the world by removing himself from it. Mara intended to save it by staying inside and lighting a match. She didn't know what the silence would do next, but it knew her now, and that made things even. For the moment, the pause doesn't lash out when it's threatened, it reflects. That's how it defends itself. Not with brute force or terror, but by turning the ones who speak against it inward, wrapping their resistance around them like a snake tightening, just enough to let you believe you can still breathe. Mara realized this the morning after the motel phone call. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. The silence in the room wasn't restful. It was dense, thick enough to smother a dream before it could even begin. The radio on the bedside table turned on at 5:13 a.m., even though it wasn't plugged in. No music played. No voice came through. Just a steady, faint static, almost like an old cassette rewinding itself infinitely. She stared at it. She didn't move. Then, on the wall across from her bed, the mirror began to fog. Not from steam. There was no shower running. No temperature change. It was breath. From the inside. As if someone, or something, stood behind the glass and exhaled slowly, deliberately, to let her know it was there. Mara rose. Every part of her wanted to turn away, to throw a blanket over it or smash it entirely. But she didn't, because fear was what the pause fed on. Not loud fear, not panic, but the silent kind, the kind you swallow. The kind you wrap in routines and pretend doesn't grow. She approached the mirror and saw it. Her reflection wasn't right. It looked like her. Same tired eyes, same tangled hair, same hoodie she hadn't taken off in 2 days. But it didn't blink when she did. It was delayed, off by maybe half a second, just enough to ruin the illusion. And it was smiling, she wasn't. Mara leaned in. Her breath fogged the glass, real this time, and for a split second, the reflection didn't mimic her at all. It tilted its head the wrong way. It watched her instead of being her. Then it whispered. No sound. Just motion. It mouthed, "You're not real anymore." Mara didn't flinch. She mouthed back, "Then why are you trying to copy me?" The reflection blinked, as if surprised. Then the glass cracked. Not shattered, not splintered. Just a thin line across the center, like the mirror had been wounded. Mara stepped back. The radio stopped. The silence returned, but it was different now. Shaken, wounded. She dressed quickly, grabbed her notebook full of written sound, and left the motel. The sky was pale and heavy with something unspoken. Not rain. Not heat. Just a pressure, like the clouds were waiting for permission to fall apart. She needed answers. Not guesses. Not symbols. Something solid. And she remembered the motel clerk, the one who had recognized her type. She returned to the lobby, but he was gone. In his place was an old television playing static, and a note on the counter written in block letters, "Fiou Kiptel Kigu Itwl start a listed y." Beneath it, a Polaroid of her, sleeping. Last night, in her room. Only she hadn't slept. She stared at it, heart racing. Not because she was scared of being watched, but because it confirmed something worse. The pause was no longer content to be observed. It was starting to observe back. It was learning speed. Reactions. Reflections. Mara pocketed the photo and left, walking into town with a purpose. She found a hardware store, bought a hammer, a tape recorder, and a dozen batteries. The cashier didn't speak, just rang her up with glazed eyes and lips pressed so tightly together they'd gone white. When she left, she saw her reflection in the store's window, only it was walking faster than she was. That night, she went to a truck stop and found a payphone. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 10 years. It rang once. Then someone answered. Mara. She froze. The voice was her mother's, alive. Except her mother had died in a fire 6 years ago. "Who is this?" Mara whispered. The voice on the other end said nothing. Then it repeated her question in the same tone. "Who is this?" Mara hung up and ran. Back to her car. Back to the road. Because now she understood the pause wasn't just erasing voices. It was harvesting them. Storing them. Like recordings in a vault. And it was ready to play them back. She drove for hours until she found a campground, surrounded by nothing but pine and the hush of wind. No mirrors, no signals, just firelight and distance. She lit a flame, spoke directly into her tape recorder. "My name is Mara, and I remember sound." She listed everything she could. Dogs barking, doors slamming, laughter in the rain, thunder that made her jump. Every sound that ever made her feel something. Because she had a theory now. The pause wasn't born from silence. It was born from forgotten sound. And maybe, just maybe, remembering was a kind of war. Her recorder clicked. Tape full. She rewound it, listened. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled, because it still worked. It played back, not twisted, not reversed, just her voice, unaffected. The pause hadn't infected everything yet. There was still time, but not much. The crack in the motel mirror was a warning. The reflection hadn't just mimicked her. It had failed to. That meant the silence had blind spots. That meant it could be cornered. And when it was, Mara planned to speak directly into its face and say what Ethan never got the chance to: "You are not the final note." There is no greater fear than forgetting you ever made a sound. Not that your voice was stolen, not that it was buried or drowned, but that it never existed at all. That's where the pause leads, not silence. Erasure, and Mara had come dangerously close to it. The crack in the mirror had been a fault line, the Polaroid a clue. The phone call from a dead voice, that was the confirmation. The pause wasn't content to suppress anymore. It was rewriting, line by line, memory by memory. Soon, the world wouldn't just forget what Ethan did. It would forget what speaking even meant. But Mara was ahead. Barely. She sat at a picnic table under a sky smeared with stars, holding the recorder like a weapon. The tape played her voice back in full, unbroken, untouched. It was a small victory, but enough to build from, enough to draw a line in the sand. Somewhere, the silence still had rules, boundaries. Something about analog, about magnetic tape and friction and the imperfections of old tools, gave it trouble. She flipped the cassette, pressed record again. "If you're hearing this, it means the pause hasn't reached everything yet," she said. "It means there's still a sliver of the world that remembers how a voice feels when it echoes back." She paused, not for drama, but because she heard footsteps, not human, not heavy, just present. Like something very tall walking through a dream you weren't meant to be awake for. She turned off the recorder and stood. The trees were quiet. No rustling, no wind. Just that thick, humming absence. Then came the whisper, not a word, not even breath. It was a repetition. The exact cadence of her last sentence played back in her voice, but flat, hollow, like someone had scrubbed the meaning from it. Oh, echoes back, she looked up. The trees around her weren't trees anymore. They were pillars. Black, unyielding, smooth like obsidian. She wasn't in the forest. She was inside the vault. Somehow, her defiance had pulled her in. Not physically. This wasn't a place you could map, but psychically. The vault where the pause stored every voice it had ever claimed. Every phrase, every word, every sound swallowed and left to rot in the dark. It looked like a cathedral without walls. Voices floated in the air like dust. She could hear Ethan's laugh, light, real, from before the bell. A lullaby sung by a woman in another language. A child screaming the word no so loud it made the space shudder. But none of them were whole. None of them finished. All cut short, all dangling mid-note, mid-syllable. Mara moved forward, gripping the recorder like a torch. The deeper she went, the more the voices sharpened, not louder, but closer, like they hovered just behind her teeth. She heard her own voice dozens of times, phrases she never remembered saying, whispers that sounded like her thinking, murmurs she might have spoken in dreams. Then she saw it, the first voice, not a person, a shape, a shimmering distortion in the air, like heat over asphalt, but colder. It pulsed with static, and it was looping something, a phrase old, cracked, but familiar. It said, "The sound between," again and again, "the sound between." Mara stepped closer. The shape noticed. It shifted, turned, bent toward her like smoke fighting gravity. She spoke. "What are you?" The vault answered not with words, but with feeling. A drop in her stomach, a weight behind her eyes. And then, the echo of a world where no one had ever spoken. No language, no music, no names, just existence, and pause. Mara understood then. This wasn't just a monster. This was before sound. It had existed before mouths knew how to shape cries, before throats knew how to sing, and when sound was born, this thing had been pushed into the cracks. But now it was back, and the only thing it feared was remembrance. She held out the recorder and hit play. Her voice filled the vault. Pure, unedited. "My name is Mara, and I remember sound." The vault reeled. The shape hissed. Not a noise, but a distortion. The pillars trembled. The stolen voices buzzed like angry insects. And for one heartbeat, Mara heard them all at once. Screams, pleas, songs, declarations of love, laughter. Everything the pause had buried, all alive for one instant. The shape tried to flee. But it couldn't, because Mara named it. "You're not silence. Your fear of being heard." That was the key. The pause wasn't quiet, it was shame. It was the feeling of speaking up and being met with nothing. Of yelling in a dream and hearing only your heartbeat. It didn't kill sound. It made people afraid to risk it. And Mara had risked it. She stood in the center of the vault and screamed, not out of terror, but with purpose. A scream of recognition. And the pause. It cracked. Not fully, not fatally. But enough. The vault walls pulsed once, then splintered like glass under pressure. The voices scattered, freed. No, not yet. But dislodged. They were no longer caged. And as Mara collapsed to her knees, the shape shrank back. Retreated. Vanished. It hadn't been defeated. But it had been named. And that was the beginning of the end. When she awoke, she was back in her car. The recorder was in her lap. Still running. Still working. And her voice was there, every word. Unbroken. The vault was real. The pause was real, and now it knew she knew. Which meant the real war had begun. The first thing Mara noticed was how the air began to repeat. Not in the literal sense, not an echo, but in sensation. She would step into a room and feel like she just stepped into it before. Open a drawer and already know what was inside. Hear a bird call outside her car window and realize she'd heard the exact same cry 3 times that day, spaced out evenly. The pause wasn't just surrounding her now, it was mirroring her, replaying the rhythm of her life in loops, not loud, not violent, just persistent. And that was somehow worse. She didn't know how long she had been driving. Time didn't seem to hold its shape anymore. The radio played her voice sometimes, unprompted. Other times it played voices she couldn't identify, but they spoke in her tone, her cadence, her emotions. They told her things she wanted to hear. You've already won. It's over. Go home. Or worse, you're the reason it's spreading. You brought it here. Each voice was slightly off, like a melody played a half step sharp. Just enough to twist comfort into confusion. One morning, she stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. The pumps didn't work. The doors were locked. But the lights were on, and a TV behind the counter played security footage of the lot. Footage that showed Mara standing still, staring directly into the camera, wearing the exact same clothes from yesterday. She watched her past self blink once, raise a hand slowly, and press her palm against the lens. Her real palm was trembling. She backed away, and then a knock came from her car window. She turned. It was her, not a mirror, not a dream, not even another reflection. It was her, standing there on the driver's side, hair down instead of tied up, same scar on the chin, same freckles under the eyes. Mara locked the doors. The other Mara smiled. Then she mouthed something through the glass. "You're in the wrong timeline." Mara started the engine and drove. Fast. Furious. Desperate to outrun the collapse of identity happening around her. Because now it was clear. The pause wasn't just stealing sound or thought or history. It was building a replacement. A world with replicas. Simulacra. Voices that sounded right but weren't. People who looked familiar but moved a little too perfectly. And Mara was the flaw in the design, the skipped beat. The unread chapter. She parked in a ghost town 3 counties over, where every house was boarded up and the streets still had leaves from 3 autumns ago. No one followed her there. No doppelgangers, no whispers, just stillness. She pulled out the recorder and played her original message again. My name is Mara, and I remember sound. It played back fine. But then a second voice followed. That's not your name anymore. It wasn't her voice, but it came from her tape, and it said the words in a tone that knew her too well. The machine sparked. She dropped it. The tape inside had melted. Only the voice remained, drifting through the air, soft and smug. You gave yourself to memory, it said. Now memory belongs to me. The voice didn't belong to any one person. It was an aggregate, built from everyone Mara had ever listened to, loved, shouted at, wept with. It was her father's chuckle, her sister's sarcasm, her best friend's comforting hum, all twisted together. The pause had created its final weapon, familiarity. Not terror, not dread. Just the soothing lull of something that feels like truth, because it used to be. But Mara wasn't done. She sat on the front porch of an abandoned home and began to write again. Not in her journal, not in the margins of a napkin this time, but across the walls with a marker. She wrote everything she remembered hearing in her life. The sound of her name called across a playground. The metallic squeal of a grocery cart's broken wheel. The heavy silence after someone tells you they're leaving and means it. She covered the walls, then the windows, then the floors, because she knew now. The pause could copy rhythm, mimic voice, even wear her face, but it couldn't create. It couldn't invent new sound. It could only borrow. And Mara was determined to leave a trail of originals behind her, like breadcrumbs through the echoing maze. At 2:12 a.m., a group of children appeared outside the house. They didn't knock, they just stood, staring. Each of them held a bell, not like the one Ethan broke. These were rougher, less elegant, made of bone and rusted tin. When they rang them, they didn't make a sound. But Mara felt it, like static in her teeth, like a skipped heartbeat. One of the children stepped forward and spoke with a voice too mature for her tiny frame. You are polluting the silence. Mara stepped outside, the marker still in her hand. Good, she said. That means you can still hear me. The child frowned. You will become one of us. Not if I keep remembering, Mara said, her voice rising. And with that, she sang. Not well, not on key, but loud, ugly and human and true. The children flinched. One dropped his bell. It cracked. And for a moment, just one, Mara saw behind the mask. The child's face shifted, flickered into something faceless and hollow. Not monstrous, just void. Then it vanished. The others scattered into smoke. Mara stood alone under a sky so dark it hummed. And the quiet that followed was different. Not peaceful, but respectful. She had made a sound that couldn't be mimicked. And the pause. It had paused back. The deeper Mara traveled, the more the world lost shape. Roads peeled away into gravel, gravel into dust, and then even dust gave up and let silence reclaim the path. She wasn't following a map anymore. She was following absence, chasing the gaps between echoes, heading toward a place the pause had always kept hidden. A place that wasn't a room or a ruin or a pit, but a beginning. Somewhere, the pause had been born or unleashed or called into being. And if she could reach that root, maybe she could speak one word loud enough to stop it from growing any further. She'd left behind the towns, the mimicry, the warped children with bells in their hands and stolen voices on their tongues. But the silence hadn't stopped following. It never did. She felt it behind her like a shadow with weight, like someone walking just far enough behind that you can't hear their steps. But you know they're there because the air remembers. It made no demands. It offered no threats. It simply was. That was its greatest weapon. It didn't conquer. It waited for surrender. But Mara had grown stubborn in the face of waiting. She walked until her feet bled, until the desert turned to flat nothing, the horizon folding in on itself like a page without text. She stopped when she saw the door. Not a building, not a structure. Just a door. Standing upright in the middle of nowhere, weathered wood with no frame, and a rusted knob that looked like it hadn't been touched in centuries. There was no wind, but the door creaked gently, back and forth, as if breathing. This was it. The origin point. The pause didn't start with silence. It started with the decision to close a door that should have been left open. Mara approached. She didn't knock. Instead, she whispered one word enough. The door swung open, not out, not in, but sideways, like the fabric of space bent to make room. Inside there was no room, no dimension, just depth, a drop of darkness so complete it made her teeth ache. But she stepped through anyway. What met her on the other side wasn't darkness. It was memory. All of it. She was walking through the history of human sound, laid out like an ocean. Every cry from a birth, every goodbye shouted across train platforms, every scream in war and prayer in peace. But they weren't playing. They were frozen, suspended in time like fossils in amber. A library of everything the pause had ever tried to erase. She reached out and touched one. It was Ethan. Not as a man, but as a moment. The final breath before he silenced the bell. His last thought, wrapped in grief and hope. She felt it surge through her fingers. A pulse of sound that had no shape, just urgency. He hadn't destroyed himself. He had encoded himself in resistance. And now she could feel the pause surrounding this space, panicking, shifting, not like a beast, but like a prison cracking. She moved faster, pulled more memories from the air. A lullaby hummed in 1922 by a mother who thought no one was listening. A dying soldier's whispered prayer to no God in particular. A little boy's uncontrollable laughter after his sister tickled him into hiccups. She let them all flood her. Let them fill her until she was shaking with noise, her body vibrating like a tuning fork slammed against a cathedral bell. She was becoming louder than herself. And then the shape appeared, the same one from the vault, but larger now. Wounded, it rippled, a storm without form, filled with stolen syllables and shattered cadence. It didn't attack, it pleaded. You can't keep all of it, it said in her own voice. You'll forget who you are. Mara bared her teeth. Maybe I'm not one voice anymore. The shape hissed. You will collapse. Then I'll collapse with sound. She opened her mouth and let it out. Not a scream, not a word. A chorus. All the voices, all the lost sounds. All the names and notes and sighs and gasps the pause had hidden. She released them. And the world shook. Not violently, but rightfully. The shape tore itself apart, trying to contain the flood, each fragment screaming in a different voice it had once stolen. The darkness cracked. The door behind her shattered. And from the black, a song emerged. Not from Mara, but from everywhere at once. It was old, and free, and real. Then she collapsed, not into darkness, but into silence. Not the pause, the real kind. The silence after a song. When your ears ring and your soul is full. She woke up in a field. Birdsong above her. Wind rustling the grass. Her tape recorder beside her. Melted but humming. She stood. The world looked the same, but she felt the difference. People would still forget. Voices would still get lost. But the pause no longer owned them. Its vault was broken. Its mirror shattered. And somewhere in the deepest parts of her, Mara knew the war wasn't over. But now, she wasn't the only one remembering. The quiet didn't vanish. It changed. It no longer crawled beneath doorways or sat heavy on rooftops like a storm waiting to fall. It wore a smile now. It dressed itself in comfort and familiarity, moved through cities like a lullaby humming under the breath of morning. After Mara released the voices from the vault, the world had not exploded. No one screamed in revelation. No sky tore open in glorious rupture. Instead, something more subtle happened. Noise returned without celebration. A child laughed in a grocery store. A busker played guitar on a subway platform. Someone shouted angrily into traffic. Life resumed, slightly cracked at the edges, but whole enough for people to pretend it had never paused. And that was the final weapon of the silence. Not erasure. Revision. People remembered that it had gotten quiet for a while. Yes, but they called it a strange season, a cultural mood, a collective burnout, or the big hush. They made podcasts about it, documentaries. They even gave it a name, the stillness, something poetic, marketable. But the truth of what Mara had seen, what she had done, what she had unleashed to bring the world back, that truth was already slipping. The silence hadn't been defeated. It had been edited, and now it was rewriting the end. Mara stood in a bookstore and watched a customer buy a memoir titled The Beauty of Quiet, Finding Peace in a Noisy World. The blurb on the back said something about how silence had saved humanity, how the world had learned to listen better. Mara nearly laughed, not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerously close to right. That was the terrifying part. The silence didn't need to destroy history. It only needed to reshape it just enough to make resistance look like disruption, to make the pause seem like a gift. She tried speaking out. She went on a radio show, told her story. The host smiled gently, tilted his head, and said, "That's interesting. A metaphor, right?" She said no. He chuckled. "Oh, you're serious." The call cut. The episode never aired. She sent her tapes to a university archive. 2 days later, she received a polite email saying they'd been damaged in shipping. But she never gave them the originals. The pause wasn't taking them back with violence. It was letting them rot with doubt. People forgot because it was easier, and that was what the pause had always counted on. Not power, not fear, but comfort. Mara nearly gave up, until she found the child. A little girl, no older than 7, sitting on the edge of a playground, drawing with sidewalk chalk. She was alone, eyes narrowed in concentration, drawing bells, dozens of them, each one different. Some cracked, some whole. One, small and lopsided, looked exactly like the one Ethan had destroyed. Mara sat beside her. "Where did you see that bell?" she asked. The girl didn't answer. She just drew another. This time, she added sound waves coming from it. Mara's voice trembled. "Do you remember the silence?" The girl stopped, then said, "The one with the fake voices." Mara blinked. The child looked at her and smiled, shy and serious all at once. "My dad says I made it up, but I didn't. I remember when my voice got taken. And then someone shouted really loud and brought it back." Mara's eyes stung. "What's your name?" The girl looked down, like she wasn't sure if it was safe to say. Then whispered Sira. That was enough. Mara left the playground knowing the silence hadn't won. Not entirely. It had failed to stop one child from remembering, and that meant it would fail again. Because memory doesn't survive through force. It survives through retelling. And Mara had work to do. She started traveling. Not to fight, not to destroy, but to teach. She went town to town, holding gatherings. Not lectures, not testimonies. Just rooms full of people sharing sounds they loved. The slap of a screen door. The crunch of fresh snow. Their grandmother's voice calling them in for dinner. The sounds were small, but they were real. And the silence couldn't mimic that kind of honesty. Every time Mara heard someone describe a noise with feeling, she felt the silence retreat just a little more. It had learned mimicry, but not meaning. It could copy pitch and tone, but it couldn't recreate the way someone's throat caught when they said their late father's name out loud for the first time. In years, it couldn't match intimacy. It couldn't replace grief, or laughter, or the broken, beautiful, unscripted noise of being alive. Eventually, people stopped asking if she was crazy. They just listened. And then, slowly, they spoke back. Someone wrote a song about her. Someone else made a podcast, not about the stillness, but about the pause that lied. Someone built a bell out of scrap metal. and left it in the center of town with a sign that read, "If you remember the quiet, ring for the noise." And people did. They rang it every day. Mara never tried to go viral. She never demanded recognition. She only asked people to stop smoothing over the story, to tell it messy, tell it honestly. And in doing so, they built something stronger than memory. They built resonance. The pause would come again. Maybe not in their lifetime. Maybe in another form. But this time, when it returned, it would find a world that knew its shape. A world that knew how to name it. And in that knowing, defy it. Mara died old, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew the difference between silence and suppression. They didn't build her a statue. They didn't call her a savior. But every year, on the anniversary of the stillness, they gathered in town square, and they made noise, clattering pans, tapping shoes, out of Quichuar's thunderous laughter. Because that was her legacy, not peace, not order, but volume that couldn't be faked. In the end, the pause didn't die. It just learned that in the face of memory, it could never be the final note. Because as long as someone remembered how it felt to be silenced, someone else would remember how to speak. And that was enough. That was always enough.